say they honestly.
All I wanna say is that they don't really
We have a cultural memory of the pandemic that goes something like this. When the emergency hit, the rules changed. We assumed that because hospitals were overwhelmed and a virus was spreading, the government suspended our normal right to make our own medical decisions. But if you actually look at the law, that did not happen. 16 years before COVID even existed, Congress wrote the rules for emergency use authorizations. That code is 21 U.S.C. Section 360 BBB-3. Looking closely at subsection E of the text, it states that anyone given an unapproved emergency use product has the legal right to be informed of the option to accept or refuse administration of the product. The government explicitly codified the right to bodily autonomy into the law almost 2 decades ago, even for the most severe public health emergencies. Fast forward to May 1, 2020. The FDA authorizes the drug remdesivir for emergency use. To comply with that 2004 statute, they had to create a mechanism for consent. They produced a 2-page document called the Patient Fact Sheet. It translated the legal code into plain English. The operative sentence says, "It is your choice to receive remdesivir or stop it at any time." The only legal way around this requirement is a formal presidential waiver, which is restricted exclusively to the armed forces for national security. For civilian patients, no waiver was ever signed. The legal floor for patient consent was completely intact. It was printed on government letterhead. On paper, the system was designed exactly as it should be, to protect a patient's choice. Yet families across the country, from California to Wisconsin to New York, are now filing wrongful death lawsuits after their relatives received remdesivir. When you read the complaints in these cases, they all share one highly specific factual allegation. The patients were given the drug, but they were never handed that FDA patient fact sheet. Instead of providing the specific emergency use disclosures, hospitals used broad, general admission forms. The authorization to treat paperwork you sign when you walk in the door acted as a blanket consent. Administrative routines simply bypassed a legal right that remains fully intact on the books today. The required paperwork vanished at the bedside, converting a legally protected choice into an unavoidable hospital mandate. You have to ask why disparate hospital systems across the country would systematically skip handing over a mandatory 2-page federal form. The answer is in the Federal Register. In March 2020, the CARES Act created a financial baseline, giving hospitals a flat 20% bump on standard Medicare payments for any patient diagnosed with COVID-19. This stacked ledger shows exactly how the money flowed. On top of that CARES baseline, the government layered a highly lucrative addition in November, the new COVID-19 Treatments Add-on Payment, or NC-TAP. This was a massive premium that hospitals received specifically and conditionally for administering remdesivir. This created a direct structural conflict. If a nurse handed a patient the FDA fact sheet, they were handing that patient the power to say no to a treatment that triggered a massive federal payout. The financial incentive to administer the drug proved far more powerful than the hospital's legal obligation to ask for permission. When families try to sue over this, they hit a wall. It is called the PREP Act, a federal statute granting medical providers near total immunity from liability for using these pandemic countermeasures. For years, lawsuits have been dismissed under this shield. But there is a doctrinal opening buried in the exact wording of the PREP Act itself. This flowchart outlines the legal catch. The law states that the immunity shield only covers a hospital if the drug is administered in accordance with Section 564. That is the specific code requiring the patient fact sheet. If a hospital failed to provide the required fact sheet, the administration violated Section 564. Legally, that means the treatment wasn't authorized. An unauthorized administration falls squarely outside the scope of the immunity shield. The 2024 Loper-Bright ruling, which ended the requirement for courts to defer to agency interpretations, makes this threshold scope argument viable in a way it wasn't when these cases were filed. The paperwork the healthcare system failed to deliver is the exact legal evidence families can now use to hold them accountable. We are looking at a federal architecture that paid hospitals to administer a drug, while turning a blind eye to whether the patient actually agreed to it. The patient became a unit of measurement. This specific financial and legal architecture processed the American people as a product, rather than serving them as its customers. Because lawmakers wrote the statute down, and because the FDA published the fact sheet, a permanent, undeniable paper trail clearly exists. The consent architecture was buried at the bedside, but it survives in the official record.
So, think about when you break your arm, right? You go in, you get an X-ray, and it shows that jagged white line on the screen. And the doctor just points at it and says, yep, there it is.
Right. It's a clean break. It's totally binary.
Exactly. It's binary. You look at that illuminating screen, you see the physical problem, and you just trust the structural integrity of the medical system to, cast it, heal it, and send you on your way.
Because that's the baseline expectation of care.
Yeah, exactly. But imagine looking at an X-ray that shows a totally shattered bone and then discovering that the hospital's administrative wing actually receives this massive federal bonus to, ignore the fracture entirely and apply a completely different, highly profitable treatment instead.
Which sounds completely dystopian.
It really does. And imagine that if you try to refuse it, there's this federal liability shield that just completely blocks you from doing anything about it. So that is the kind of diagnostic muddy water we are diving into today regarding the antiviral drug remdesivir. Welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here. There is a lot of ground to cover.
There really is. Today, we're taking this massive stack of documentary evidence. I mean, we're talking about a 7-part investigative series called the FAUCI Files, federal statutes, public financial filings, peer-reviewed medical journals, and even active court dockets. And we're unpacking the structural architecture of a massive system failure. Okay, let's unpack this.
We are looking at a collision between medical science, federal law, and just massive financial incentives. And I want to be clear right up front. We are doing this strictly by following the public documentary record.
Right, no conspiracy theories here.
Exactly. We aren't here to give medical advice, and we definitely aren't here to litigate the political culture wars. We are examining a real-world case study of what actually happens when a pharmaceutical product, one that had failed previous clinical trials, I might add, is maneuvered into becoming a federally subsidized standard of care during a massive crisis.
And the reason you, listening to this right now, need to care about a stack of dry regulatory and financial documents is that this touches on the most fundamental right you possess as a human being.
Right.
Which is bodily autonomy.
The absolute legal and ethical right to determine what happens to your own physical person.
Exactly. We're going to trace how legal and financial systems operate under the immense pressure of a global emergency and how an architecture was built where the patient fundamentally, ceased being a patient and just became the bottom row of a ledger.
Well, to understand that architecture, we actually have to step back from the emergency itself.
Right. Back before 2020.
Yeah, we have to rewind the clock to before anyone had ever heard of a lockdown or a mandate, because we have to look at the genesis of the compound itself. Remdesivir was not this brand new, untested molecule miraculously discovered in early 2020.
No, it had a highly documented and, honestly, a highly troubled history.
Very troubled.
Let's talk about the origin of the drug, because it starts, like so many things do, with your tax dollars.
Right.
Remdesivir was developed by Gilead Sciences, but they didn't do it alone in some private vacuum.
No, the public investment was massive.
Right. According to a 2021 report from the Government Accountability Office, the GAO federal agencies, so we're talking about the NIH, the CDC, the Department of Defense, they poured an estimated $162 million into the preclinical research and development for this drug between 2013 and 2020.
Though, to be totally fair to the numbers, there is an independent analysis by Public Citizen that puts the direct taxpayer contributions slightly lower at around $70.5 million.
Okay, 70 million, 160 million. But regardless of which ledger you look at, the structural reality is the same, right? Tens to hundreds of millions of public dollars were utilized to fund the foundational laboratory work, the early screening, and the testing of this specific molecule.
Yes. The public took on the heavy financial lifting during the riskiest phase of development.
But wait, when the government, which means the public funds the research and development of a piece of technology or a pharmaceutical compound, there is usually some sort of return on investment, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a patent share, a royalty agreement, some mechanism where the taxpayer sees a benefit from carrying all that financial risk.
You would assume so, but in this specific instance, the U.S. government secured exactly 0 patent rights.
Wow.
Yeah, they secured no royalty interests whatsoever. The structural arrangement was that the government funded the highly volatile, risky phase of preclinical lab work, but Gilead Sciences retained the entirety of the intellectual property.
So the taxpayers basically bought the raw materials, built the laboratory, and paid the scientists to discover the formula, and then the corporation just walked away with the exclusive legal right to sell that formula back to the taxpayers.
That is essentially the baseline we are starting from.
That is an incredible baseline.
When you walk into a modern hospital, there is a baseline expectation. You assume the treatments you receive are backed by rigorous scientific consensus and that your physical well-being is the ultimate priority. The origin of remdesivir challenges that assumption. In 2019, the drug was tested in the Democratic Republic of the Congo against the Ebola virus. It was dropped from the trial because it underperformed. Mortality in the remdesivir arm reached 53%. The contradicting international science published that very morning was simply ignored. The mystery of 2020 is not just why a failed drug was approved, but how a carefully guarded regulatory system was bypassed to apply that drug to hundreds of thousands of hospitalized Americans. Federal law, specifically Section 564 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, dictates that anyone given an unapproved emergency use product has a strict statutory right to be told they can refuse it. The FDA put that law into practice by issuing a patient fact sheet. The document states in plain English, "It is your choice to receive remdesivir or stop it at any time." But if you read the wrongful death lawsuits filed in state and federal courts across the country, you find a uniform factual allegation. U.S. hospitals systematically withheld this exact document from patients upon admission. The record shows that as the federal government prepared a new set of protocols for the pandemic, the patient's statutory right to refuse was being removed from the clinical process. Look at the top of the ledger. Gilead Sciences developed this drug utilizing $162 million in U.S. taxpayer funding, but the government secured no patent rights and the public received zero return on that investment. This chart compares the initial public investment to the private payout. The small bar is the $162 million taxpayer dollars. The massive bar is the $8 billion Gilead generated in revenue across 2 years, securing a nearly 90% gross profit margin. And as Congress drafted the CARES Act, defining hospital funding, Gilead spent $2.45 million on federal lobbying in a single quarter. The structural conflict reached the regulators themselves. Of the members sitting on the NIH panel responsible for recommending COVID treatments, 11 had documented financial ties to Gilead. At the highest institutional levels, the nation's pandemic response was authored and endorsed by the exact entities positioned to profit from the rollout. On the hospital level, the CARES Act created a new financial baseline. Any Medicare patient admitted with a COVID-19 diagnosis automatically triggered a 20% increase in the hospital's standard payment. This schematic shows the NC-TAP multiplier. On top of the base payment and 20% bump, hospitals could claim a federal subsidy covering 65% of excess case costs. To qualify, the payment was only issued if they explicitly administered an authorized treatment like remdesivir. In November 2020, the World Health Organization reviewed the global trial data and explicitly told the world to stop using the drug. The United States ignored that consensus, keeping the payments flowing to hospitals for nearly 3 more years. U.S. institutions ignored international safety warnings because the federal government had built an architecture that literally paid them by the dose to do so. At the very bottom of this ledger is the patient, and the true cost of this financial machine was paid with their physical health. The biological mechanism is documented in the pharmacology literature. The drug utilizes a specific solvent compound. In patients with compromised kidney function, this solvent cannot be safely excreted. It rapidly accumulates, creating severe toxicity in the renal system. This graphic displays data from the FDA's own adverse event reporting system. It shows that among patients who suffered a remdesivir-associated kidney injury, the fatality rate reached 36.45%. More than 1 in 3 of those reported injuries ended in death. The system functioned with lethal efficiency, prioritizing the execution of a lucrative protocol over the physical survival of the people in the hospital beds. Congress passed the PREP Act to grant blanket legal immunity to hospitals and physicians during a declared emergency, shielding the medical system from liability for these outcomes. But that immunity is strictly contingent upon hospitals acting in accordance with Section 564. And Section 564 is the exact law mandating that the patient be given the right to refuse. Because hospitals systematically failed to deliver the patient fact sheet, they operated outside the bounds of the law. That failure cracks the immunity shield, creating a clear legal pathway for wrongful death accountability. In this ledger, the patient is the final unit of measurement. They are the biological product sustaining an architecture built on a foundation of legal immunity and direct financial incentive.
But the financial arrangement is really only half the story here. The clinical reality of what this drug actually did in the real world is where the red flags really start flying. Take us to 2018.
Right, so in 2018 and 2019, remdesivir was deployed into the PAL-M trial. This was an active clinical trial conducted in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
And what were they targeting?
The objective was to test treatments against the Ebola virus. Remdesivir was entered into this trial alongside 3 other experimental therapies.
And Ebola is obviously an incredibly aggressive, highly lethal virus. So you would naturally assume any drug being tested against it is a pretty heavy hitter.
Right, but remdesivir didn't just fail to be the best drug in this trial. It was actively pulled from the trial in August 2019.
Wait, pulled completely?
Yes, it was pulled by the Data Safety Monitoring Board for what they called, quote, inferiority.
Walk me through what that actually means in trial terms.
So, when a trial is running, independent monitors look at the unblinded data as it comes in, just to ensure it is still ethical to continue giving patients these experimental compounds. If one compound is drastically underperforming or actively harming people, it becomes medically unethical to keep giving it to a control group.
Because you're basically denying them the stuff that actually works.
Exactly. In the case of remdesivir, 2 other treatments in the trial were substantially outperforming it.
Substantially is almost an understatement here, isn't it? Because the mortality rate, the rate of death in the remdesivir arm of that Ebola trial reached 53%.
53%, yes.
More than half the people receiving the drug died.
And beyond just the sheer mortality failure, the clinical data revealed physiological distress. Elevated markers for liver and kidney damage were specifically documented in the patients receiving the drug.
So the biological toxicity was pretty evident.
Very evident.
I want to make sure the gravity of this track record is perfectly clear for everyone listening. It's like taxpayers funding the research and development for a state-of-the-art sports car.
Right.
The public pays to design the engine. But when the car actually gets out on the test track, it completely fails the safety and performance tests.
The wheels come off.
Exactly. The brakes don't work, the engine overheats, and it gets disqualified from the race entirely. But the manufacturer, who kept all the patents, just locks the car in a garage. And then a year later, pulls it back out and sells it to the public at an absolute premium for a completely different type of race.
Which brings up the central mystery of the early pandemic response. By early 2020, remdesivir was not a promising, cutting-edge therapeutic just waiting in the wings.
Not at all.
By objective scientific standards, it was a compound that had been tested against a serious viral pathogen, had significantly underperformed, had exhibited highly concerning safety signals regarding organ toxicity, and had been formally removed from active investigation. It was a shelved compound.
So how does a drug get eliminated from a trial for safety and efficacy reasons, and then end up at the very front of the line for a totally different global health crisis just a few months later?
To answer that, we aren't looking at some multi-year scientific breakthrough. We are looking at a highly specific, intense pressure cooker of a timeline. We have to examine a remarkably narrow window of time where the entire scientific, political, and medical narrative shifted globally.
And what window is that?
We are talking about exactly 6 days in late April 2020.
It took exactly 6 days in April 2020 for a failed drug to become a national mandate. On April 23rd, an accidental leak revealed the compound offered no statistically significant benefit. Within 96 hours, federal researchers moved the focus away from mortality, rewriting the rules to measure time to recovery. By April 29th, Anthony Fauci stood inside the Oval Office and announced the revised data, establishing a drug that had been pulled from an Ebola trial as the new standard of care. With that single executive endorsement, an entirely new, federally funded protocol began flowing directly into the veins of patients entering the American hospital ward. To legally administer this unapproved product, the FDA established a strict regulatory floor. The agency issued a patient fact sheet, explicitly naming the federal statutory right to refuse the treatment. Yet in the operational reality of 2020, a coast-to-coast pattern emerged where families alleged these mandatory consent documents were systematically withheld, replaced by broad, generic admission forms. As the legal guarantee of bodily autonomy vanished at the hospital doors, administrators were quietly looking at a deeply lucrative administrative ledger. The federal government actively paid hospitals to administer this specific chemical, stacking a 20% CARES Act hospitalization bonus directly on top of a massive 65% add-on payment. This architecture effectively re-engineered the medical system, treating hospitalized Medicare beneficiaries as revenue triggers for the administration above. This highly profitable machinery ran completely unchecked until the autumn of 2020, when the United States system collided with the emerging global consensus. On November 20th, the World Health Organization officially recommended against using the drug, yet the American medical apparatus kept paying hospitals to administer it. They kept paying even as the FDA's own internal safety databases logged a 36.45% fatality proportion among reports of remdesivir-associated acute kidney injury. Despite the mounting bodies and the glaring international warnings, the federal protocol remained locked in place for nearly 3 more years. Now, a nationwide wave of wrongful death lawsuits is sweeping through the courts, from California to New York, brought by families demanding answers for how their right to bodily autonomy was circumvented. For years, these grieving plaintiffs have repeatedly smashed into the PREP Act. This formidable legal immunity wall has, since 2020, blocked families from the courtrooms they are trying to reach. But a sudden, massive crack has just split that legal armor wide open, triggered by recent Supreme Court rulings that have fractured the existing framework of immunity. Read the public documents, review the trial fingerprints, trace the money. Access the complete record in the FAUCI Files Part 1.
From April 23rd to April 29th. If you want to understand the structural architecture of how a failed drug becomes a standard of care, those 6 days are the blueprint.
Let's walk through this window day by day then, because the chronology here is just fascinating. We start on April 23rd, 2020.
Right.
The world is in absolute lockdown. The panic is at its absolute peak, and the World Health Organization accidentally posts a draft of something called the Wang trial on their website.
The Wang trial is a foundational piece of evidence in this story. It was a rigorous, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial conducted in China. It involved 237 hospitalized adults with severe COVID-19.
And just to clarify for everyone, in the hierarchy of medical evidence, a randomized controlled trial, an RCT is the gold standard, right?
It is the absolute gold standard. It is specifically designed to strip away bias and show exactly what a drug does compared to a placebo.
Okay, so the WHO accidentally leaks this draft summary. And I mean, it gets pulled down almost immediately, but it's the internet. Nothing's ever really deleted. The Financial Times and Stat News grab copies of the draft, and the headlines hit that afternoon.
And the headlines are brutal. The drug flopped.
Just totally flopped.
Yeah. The leaked findings of the Wang trial showed that remdesivir was, quote, not associated with statistically significant clinical benefits. It did not meaningfully change the course of the disease for these severe patients, but equally important was the safety data.
Right, the adverse events.
The trial showed that adverse events caused early discontinuation of the drug in 12% of the patients receiving remdesivir.
12%. And compare that to the placebo group, right? Only 5% of the patients getting a literal sugar water ARV had to stop because of adverse events.
Exactly.
So more than double the number of people on the actual drug couldn't even finish the treatment regimen because their bodies were reacting so poorly to it.
It's a stark contrast.
So on April 23rd, the world gets a sneak peek at the very first rigorous gold standard trial, and the answer is clear. The drug does not work, and it is likely harming patients.
Which brings us to the next highly controversial phase of the 6-day window, April 24th through the 27th. Back in the United States, the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, was running its own clinical trial on remdesivir.
Okay.
This trial was known as ACTT-1. Right in the specific window immediately following the disastrous leak of the Wang trial data, the administrators of the ACTT-1 trial executed a major protocol amendment.
Okay, wait.
They fundamentally changed their primary endpoint.
Okay, stop right there. I need to understand the nuts and bolts of this. What does it actually mean, practically and mathematically, to change a primary endpoint in the middle of a clinical trial?
What's fascinating here is the rigid mathematics of clinical trial design. When you design a trial, you have to define what you are looking for before you even start.
Right, you have to call your shot.
Exactly. That is your primary endpoint. It is the main question the trial is mathematically powered to answer. Originally, the ACTT-1 trial's primary endpoint was measured on an 8-point ordinal scale of clinical status at day 15.
An 8-point scale, meaning 1 is the worst possible outcome and 8 is the best.
Essentially, yes. A score of 1 on this scale is death. A score of 8 is fully recovered and discharged. Crucially, this original endpoint heavily weighted mortality.
Which makes sense.
It was designed to ask the most important question in a lethal pandemic. Does this drug save lives? Will it prevent a patient from reaching a score of 1 by day 15?
Right. That makes perfect sense. If you have a deadly virus, the primary goal of the drug should be stopping death. But you're saying between April 24th and 27th, they just abandoned that question.
They completely changed the primary endpoint to, quote, time to recovery. Time to recovery does not heavily weight mortality. It simply measures how many days it takes for a patient to get out of the hospital or no longer require supplemental oxygen or medical care.
It's like moving the goalposts in the fourth quarter of a football game.
That's a good way to put it.
You look at the field, you realize your offense is stalling out, and you aren't going to score a touchdown, which, in this analogy, is saving a patient's life. So you suddenly call a timeout, huddle up the referees, and declare that from now on, getting 3 first downs wins the game. You change the definition of winning right before the clock runs out, because you know you can't achieve the original objective.
The analogy holds up incredibly well when we look at the statistical mechanics. Changing an endpoint right before you unblind the data is highly unusual.
Unblinding is when they finally look at the results.
Yes, unblinding is the moment when you unlock the spreadsheet and finally see which patients got the drug and which got the placebo. The issue is that a trial is powered, meaning it calculates the required sample size and statistical thresholds based entirely on its primary endpoint.
So if you design a trial to measure death, the math requires a certain number of patients and a certain margin of difference to prove the drug works.
Correct. When the NIH switched the primary endpoint to time to recovery, the trial was suddenly answering a question it wasn't originally mathematically optimized to ask.
And what happened to the mortality data? Did it just disappear?
The mortality data didn't vanish, of course, but it was demoted. It was moved to what are called secondary outcomes. And secondary outcomes do not legally or statistically carry the same weight when declaring a trial a success to regulatory bodies.
Wow.
Independent statisticians who reviewed the ACTT-1 data later pointed out a critical fact. If the NIH had kept the original mortality-weighted endpoint, the trial would not have reached statistical significance.
It would have been a failed trial. Let that sink in. If they hadn't moved the goalposts, the U.S. government's own trial would have mirrored the Chinese Wang trial. It would have shown the drug didn't work.
But they moved the goalposts. So on April 28th, the ACTT-1 data is locked in at this brand new, vastly easier metric of time to recovery. Which brings us to the crescendo of this timeline, April 29th.
Walk me through the 29th.
April 29th is an extraordinary day in the history of medical publishing and federal policy. On the morning of April 29th, the prestigious medical journal The Lancet officially publishes the Wang trial in full.
Okay, so the leak from the 23rd is now official.
Yeah. The data that was leaked a week earlier is now fully peer-reviewed, vetted, and released to the global scientific community. The conclusion is definitive. No statistically significant clinical benefit, and adverse events are significantly higher on remdesivir, including severe liver injury and worsened cardiopulmonary status.
A total peer-reviewed failure published in literally one of the most respected medical journals on Earth.
Yeah.
But that exact same morning, the NIH launches a massive counter-narrative, right?
Right.
They issue a press release with the preliminary results from their newly altered ACTT-1 trial.
That's right. The NIH announces that time to recovery was reduced. Patients on the placebo recovered in an average of 15 days. Patients on remdesivir recovered in an average of 11 days.
So they got out of the hospital 4 days faster. What about the mortality data? You know, the thing they demoted to a secondary outcome.
Well, they did release the preliminary mortality data, but as predicted, it was not statistically significant. The mortality rate was 7.1% on the drug versus 11.9% on the placebo.
I mean, that looks like a difference on paper.
Well, that looks like a difference. The p-value, which is the statistical measure of whether a result could just be random chance, was 0.059. In the rigid world of clinical trials, standard significance requires a p-value of less than 0.05. Therefore, scientifically speaking, it was not proof of saving lives. It was proof of a 4-day reduction in hospital stay.
But, you know, The nuance of a 0.059 p-value doesn't really make it to the evening news, does it? Because on the afternoon of April 29th, this all culminates in a press event in the Oval Office of the White House.
During that event, the narrative is firmly established. The preliminary, unpublished results of the ACTT-1 trial are presented as a monumental breakthrough. The drug is framed as a, quote, new standard of care. The results are publicly called highly significant.
And what absolutely floors me about this documentary record is what isn't said in that room. I mean, there is no mention of the Wang trial that was published in The Lancet literally that same morning. There's no mention that the drug definitively failed in China. And there was absolutely no mention that the NIH changed the statistical rules of their own trial just days before unlocking the data.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are witnessing the sheer, undeniable force of policy momentum. You really have to place yourself in the structural reality of April 2020.
Everyone was terrified.
Exactly. The United States apparatus was under immense pressure to deliver a treatment. The economy was shuttered, the public was terrified, the hospitals were bracing for collapse. In that specific structural environment, preliminary data from a government-run trial, even a trial with a last-minute altered endpoint, was always going to overshadow a fully published, peer-reviewed trial from a foreign country. The system demanded a victory.
And that momentum leads inevitably to May 1st. Just 2 days after the Oval Office announcement, the FDA issues an emergency use authorization, an EUA, for remdesivir, a drug that failed against Ebola, failed in a gold standard Chinese trial, and passed an NIH trial only after the finish line was literally redrawn, is now federally authorized for injection into the American public.
But the issuance of that EUA on May 1st is where the legal architecture of this story takes a massive turn, because the FDA did not just grant blanket, unconditional approval for this drug to be used however doctors saw fit.
Right, there were strings attached.
Yeah. Heavy strings. The authorization came with explicit, mandatory legal conditions regarding patient rights. And the massive gap between those legal requirements on paper and the operational reality in hospital wards across the country is the core of the ongoing litigation right now.
So the FDA signs the paper. But, you know, a piece of paper in Washington, D.C. doesn't magically inform a patient lying in a hospital bed in Ohio. Let's look at the federal floor of bodily autonomy. When you are given an experimental or emergency drug, what are your actual legal rights? We have to look at Section 564 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act.
Right. Section 564 is the specific federal statute that grants the FDA the power to issue emergency use authorizations. Normally, drug approval takes years of multi-phase testing. The EUA process allows the FDA to bypass that standard approval timeline during a declared crisis.
But Congress recognized that allowing unapproved experimental products to be widely administered carries massive ethical risks.
They knew they were playing with fire.
Yeah, so they built a firewall into the law itself.
Exactly the intent. Congress wrote a specific safeguard into Section 564, subsection E1. A 2 Roman numeral 3 is the critical text here.
Rolls right off the tongue.
Right. But the text is vital. It explicitly mandates that when an unapproved emergency use product is administered, the patient must be informed of 3 things. First, they must be informed that the FDA has authorized the emergency use of the product. Second, they must be informed of the significant known and potential benefits and risks. And third, and this is key, they must be informed of the option to accept or refuse administration of the product and of the consequences of refusing.
The right to refuse an experimental or emergency drug isn't just a philosophical concept debated in university bioethics classes. It is baked into the hard statutory code of the United States. It is a mandatory, non-negotiable condition of the authorization. If you do not give the patient the explicit right to refuse, you are technically operating outside the legal bounds of the EUA.
And the FDA implemented this statutory requirement by creating a highly specific document, the FDA Patient Fact Sheet. They didn't leave it up to doctors to casually mention it in passing. They drafted the specific language.
And what did it say?
The plain language of the fact sheet, published on May 1st, states, unequivocally, quote, "It is your choice to receive remdesivir or stop it at any time." Furthermore, the healthcare provider fact sheet, which are the instructions given to the hospitals, required the prescriber to confirm that the patient or caregiver had been given this information and formally informed of their right to refuse.
Wait, I'm stuck on something here. If it is federal statute, is there any loophole? I mean, could a governor or a hospital administrator just declare an emergency and suspend that right?
The statute is incredibly narrow on waivers. The law states there is only one mechanism to waive this right to informed consent.
What is it?
The President of the United States can waive it, but only for members of the armed forces, and only if obtaining consent is not feasible or is contrary to the best interests of national security.
So unless you were an active duty soldier deployed in a war zone and the president personally signs a waiver, you have the absolute legal right to say no.
Yes, and there was absolutely no waiver issued for American civilians during this crisis. The right to say no was legally ironclad.
But, that is the law on paper. What the documentary record shows happened inside the actual hospital rooms is a chillingly different story.
This systemic failure is currently documented in wrongful death litigation across multiple jurisdictions. We're seeing it in California, Nevada, Wisconsin, New York. We are looking at cases like Briones, Casale, Shara, and Charles.
And what's the common thread?
The individual medical trajectories of the patients in these cases obviously vary, but the unifying legal allegation in every single complaint is structural. Hospitals systematically failed to provide the FDA patient fact sheet.
If the FDA printed the exact words on a piece of paper that says, it is your choice, how does a multi-million-dollar hospital system just bypass it? Were the nurses just overwhelmed by the chaos of crowded ICUs? Did they just forget in the rush? Because the lawsuits allege something much more organized.
They do.
They allege that patients were admitted, they were handed broad, generic, general admission consent forms, the kind that just say, I consent to routine hospital care and diagnostics. And then they were administered this emergency use drug without ever seeing the specific fact sheet.
The plaintiffs in these cases argue that this bypass was not accidental chaos. It was a structural decision. The legal mechanics are vital here. A general admission form cannot, by its very legal nature, provide informed consent for a specific, unapproved emergency drug.
Right.
Especially a drug that hasn't even been prescribed yet at the exact moment the patient signs the admission paperwork in the emergency room lobby. The federal statute required specific affirmative consent for this specific product.
Let's visualize this. Imagine you are buying a piece of heavy, potentially dangerous industrial machinery. The federal law mandates that the seller must hand you a highly specific safety manual that explains exactly where the emergency shutoff valve is, what the failure rates are, and explicitly ask you to sign that you understand the risks.
A reasonable requirement.
Right. But instead, when you buy the machine, the seller hands you a generic cash register receipt, tosses the safety manual in the shredder under the desk, and just hands you the keys.
And if you are injured by that machine, the seller cannot point to the generic receipt and say, well, you agreed to buy something.
Exactly.
That is essentially the legal argument regarding bodily autonomy in these hospitals. And this principle has incredibly deep roots in American jurisprudence.
I want to talk about those roots, actually, because it really shows how far we drifted.
The baseline precedent is the 1914 Schlöendorff ruling in New York. Justice Benjamin Cardozo, who later served on the Supreme Court, famously wrote the defining sentence of medical autonomy. He wrote, quote, "Every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body."
Wow.
That 1914 ruling established the baseline. The federal statute for the EUA respected that baseline by mandating the fact sheet, but the operational reality in the hospitals allegedly erased it entirely.
Which begs the massive multi-billion-dollar question here. If hospitals were legally required to provide this fact sheet, and they knew the drug carried severe risks of organ toxicity, why systematically bypass the consent? Why rush the drug into the IV line without having the conversation with the patient or their family?
Well,
To answer that, we have to follow the money. We have to look at the federal ledger.
the financial architecture built around this specific drug is meticulously documented in the Federal Register. It is not hidden at all. It is public administrative law. The foundation was laid with the CARES Act, signed into law in March 2020. Section 3710 of the CARES Act directed a highly specific adjustment to hospital billing.
Okay, what was the adjustment?
It directed a 20% increase in the diagnosis-related group, or DRG, waiting for COVID-19 diagnoses.
Hold on. Walk me through the mechanics of a DRG. How does a hospital actually bill Medicare? I don't think most people know how that works.
Right. So when a patient is admitted to a hospital under Medicare, the hospital does not simply send an itemized receipt to the government at the end of the stay, charging $5 for a bandage, $10 for an aspirin, and so on. That would be an administrative nightmare.
Yeah, that would be impossible to track.
Instead, Medicare utilizes a prospective payment system based on DRG's diagnosis-related groups. It is a bundled, flat-rate payment for treating a specific condition.
Okay, so if a patient comes in with pneumonia, the hospital looks at the DRG code for pneumonia, and Medicare says, we will pay you exactly $10,000 for this case. And it doesn't matter if the hospital cures the patient in 2 days using $2,000 worth of resources, or if the patient stays for 3 weeks and costs the hospital $15,000. The hospital gets the flat $10,000.
Precisely. The system is designed to incentivize efficiency. If the hospital treats the patient for less than the DRG payment, hospital keeps the profit. If the treatment costs more, the hospital absorbs the loss. Now, apply the CARES Act to this mechanism.
Okay.
The law stated that if the patient's diagnosis is COVID-19, the standard DRG payment is automatically increased by 20%.
So that $10,000 baseline immediately becomes $12,000 just for the diagnosis.
Based on analyses conducted by the Kaiser Family Foundation, the real-world numbers were substantial. The average Medicare payment per COVID-19 hospitalization became roughly $23,000. For severely ill patients who required mechanical ventilation, that bundled payment could rise to around $40,000 per admission.
That is a massive baseline financial incentive just for admitting and diagnosing a patient. But the architecture went so much further than just the admission, didn't it? The government started tying massive financial bonuses to the specific treatments being used.
They created a structural add-on. On November 2nd, 2020, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, implemented a new rule. It was called the NCPAP, the new COVID-19 treatments add-on payment.
The NCTAP, this is the mechanism that really changes everything. Explain how an add-on payment breaks that DRG flat rate model you just mentioned.
The NCTAP was designed to mitigate the financial risk for hospitals using expensive new therapeutics. It was an enhanced reimbursement layer on top of the standard 20% DRG bump. The rule stated that if a hospital administered an eligible authorized treatment and the cost of the patient's care exceeded the standard DRG payment, Medicare would pay an additional 65% of the outlier case costs.
65% of the excess costs. That is a massive financial cushion.
But the critical factor is the conditionality. This massive add-on payment was strictly conditional on the hospital administering a specific authorized treatment. And at the time this rule was issued, the list of eligible treatments was incredibly narrow.
How narrow?
In practical terms, it was restricted to convalescent plasma and remdesivir.
Let's build an analogy for this because the perverse incentives here are just staggering. It's like going to a restaurant where the waiter's tip isn't based on how much you enjoyed the meal or the quality of the service. The tip is paid directly by the government. But the waiter only receives that government tip if they manage to get you to eat one specific, highly profitable dish on the menu.
That's entirely accurate.
Right. If you order the steak, the waiter gets 0 tip. If you order the federally subsidized soup, the waiter gets a 65% bonus.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the economic pressure is immense. The government didn't just authorize remdesivir. They built a per-administration federal subsidy that functionally mandated its use if a hospital wanted to remain financially solvent during a period when all of their highly profitable elective surgeries had been canceled.
Wow.
The hospital's revenue stream was optimized if, and only if, they put this specific drug into the patient's IV line.
And the timeline of when this NC-TAP rule was implemented is mind-blowing. I mean, the rule was issued in November 2020.
The timeline is a massive point of systemic conflict. November 2020 is weeks after the global scientific community began publishing massive international data showing the drug was completely ineffective. While international data was aggressively trending away from the drug, the U.S. financial architecture was doubling down, locking in a permanent financial incentive for American hospitals to use it.
And if you follow the money all the way up the chain, you end up in the winner's circle. Let's look at Gilead Sciences' financial filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Because while the hospitals were collecting the 65% add-on payments, the manufacturer was experiencing historic revenue.
According to their SEC filings, Gilead recorded $8.4 billion in sales of remdesivir across the years 2020 and 2021.
$8 billion.
$8.4 billion. And investigative reporting by Axios indicated that the gross profit margins on these government-subsidized sales approached 90%. By January of 2021, Gilead's CEO publicly reported that 50% of all hospitalized COVID patients in the United States were receiving the drug.
half of the people in hospital beds in America were receiving a drug that failed an Ebola trial for toxicity and inferiority because it was backed by a federal payment bonus. And how did it stay on the recommended guidelines despite all the failures? I mean, who was deciding this?
This involves an analysis of structural conflicts of interest. Investigative reporting by Cheryl Atkinson scrutinized the advisory bodies responsible for recommending these treatments to the hospitals.
What did she find?
She documented that 11 members of the NIH COVID-19 Treatment Guidelines Panel, the very panel whose published recommendations dictated the standard of care for U.S. hospitals and triggered the NC-TAP payments, had documented financial ties to Gilead Sciences.
11 members. And what about the lobbying money behind the scenes?
Public lobbying disclosures show that Gilead spent $2.45 million on lobbying in just the first quarter of 2020.
Wait, the first quarter?
Yes. This was precisely the window when Congress was drafting the CARES Act and establishing the initial financial architecture.
Are you telling me that the system was built so that the people recommending the drug were financially tied to the company making it, and the hospitals administering the drug were receiving massive federal bonuses for using it?
I'm telling you that the documentary record reflects a tightly closed loop of financial and regulatory incentives. When survival for hospitals becomes inextricably tied to rigid protocol adherence, the operational reality on the floor completely changes.
The patient transforms. They are no longer a customer receiving individualized medical care based on a nuanced doctor-patient relationship. The patient becomes a biological unit of measurement.
A line item.
Exactly. Their admission triggers a 20% diagnosis bonus. Administering the remdesivir protocol triggers the 65% NC-TAP add-on payment. The ledger demands the drug be given. If a nurse hands the patient the FDA fact sheet and the patient reads it and exercises their federal statutory right to say no, the hospital instantly loses the NC-TAP payment. The financial architecture basically incentivized the erasure of informed consent.
And while the U.S. was constructing this financial machine to mandate the drug's use, the rest of the global scientific community was analyzing the actual real-world patient outcomes. And what they saw caused them to aggressively hit the emergency brakes. We have to examine the pharmacovigilance signals.
In 1914, the courts established a foundational rule for medical treatment. Every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body. For decades, that was the standard. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, a different narrative took hold. The idea that because we were in a state of emergency, the government had legally suspended these individual rights. However, if you look at the Federal Emergency Use Statute passed by Congress in 2004, the law actually says the opposite. It explicitly mandates that patients must be informed of the option to accept or refuse the administration of the product. While the law does allow a president to waive this right to refuse, that power is limited strictly to members of the armed forces and requires a written national security justification. No such waiver was ever issued for civilian patients. Since the right to say no was legally intact the entire time, we have to look at why, in practice, the treatment protocols functioned like a mandate. That question is now moving through the court system in a wave of wrongful death lawsuits filed by families against hospitals across the country. These complaints allege that patients were administered powerful, unapproved emergency treatments without ever being told they had a federal statutory right to say no. It raises the question of how a protection guaranteed by Congress managed to disappear at the hospital bedside. These families aren't claiming that lawmakers in Washington repealed their rights. They are alleging that those rights were simply never acknowledged during the admission process. To see how this worked, we have to look at the day the FDA authorized remdesivir for emergency use, May 1, 2020. The FDA operationalized the federal consent law by creating a specific 2-page document called the Patient Fact Sheet. The language in that document was clear. It is your choice to receive remdesivir or stop it at any time. But the lawsuits describe a different reality. Patients signed generic, broad admission forms, but according to the legal complaints, they were systematically never given this specific FDA fact sheet. The consent process wasn't overridden by a new law. It was bypassed through an administrative omission, by withholding the one document that explained the patient's right to choose. Why would a hospital system fail to provide a simple 2-page document that the federal government required? This represents Medicare payments during the pandemic. Under the CARES Act, hospitals received a 20% boost for COVID-19 patients. In November 2020, the NC-TAP add-on provided an additional 65% bonus, conditional on administering an authorized treatment, like remdesivir. This created a direct conflict between the medical protocol and the patient's rights. Handing over the FDA fact sheet would have explicitly informed the patient they could say no, and if the patient said no, the hospital would lose the massive federal subsidy tied to that specific drug. The result was a financial system that paid for the administration of the drug, which effectively silenced the legal system meant to ensure patient consent. For years, hospitals have used the PREP Act to block these lawsuits. It's a sweeping legal shield that grants them immunity from liability for using emergency countermeasures. However, recent Supreme Court rulings have changed how courts interpret federal agency power, opening a path for a new legal argument. The PREP Act only grants immunity if the treatment was administered in accordance with Section 564, the same law that mandates the right to refuse. If a hospital withheld the required fact sheet, they failed to meet the conditions of the authorization. And without a valid authorization, the legal shield of the PREP Act may no longer apply. By failing to honor the consent law, hospitals may have inadvertently removed the very immunity they rely on for protection. The documentary record shows a structure where financial incentives were designed to drive treatment, and legal shields were designed to protect the providers. In this environment, the patient was no longer the subject of the care, but a unit of measurement used to trigger federal payments. The right to say no was never actually lost in the law. It was just treated as if it didn't exist. Now it's up to the court.
Pharmacovigilance. Monitoring a drug's safety and effectiveness after it hits the mass market. Because a controlled trial of 200 people in China, or 1,000 people at the NIH, is very different from pumping a drug into half the hospital beds in America.
The signals were glaring, and they came from the highest levels of global health. On November 20th, 2020, the very same month, the U.S. implemented the NC-TAP bonus payments. The World Health Organization formally advised against the use of remdesivir in hospitalized COVID-19 patients, regardless of disease severity.
The WHO told the world to stop. Why?
Their recommendation was based on the WHO's own Solidarity trial. This was a massive international undertaking involving over 14,000 patients across dozens of countries.
14,000, that's a huge sample size.
The sheer statistical power of 14,000 patients cannot be ignored. And the Solidarity trial found that remdesivir had little to no effect on 28-day mortality, and it did not meaningfully reduce the length of hospital stays.
So the premier global health body looks at 14,000 patients and says, this does not save lives, stop using it. But the United States government completely ignores this international consensus. They keep the FDA authorization active, and they keep the NC-TAP bonus payments flowing to American hospitals to use the drug for nearly 3 more years.
And the global concerns rapidly expanded beyond just a lack of efficacy. They shifted to active physiological harm.
Like what we saw in the Ebola trial.
Exactly. In June 2021, the European Medicines Agency, the EMA, formally added sinus bradycardia, which is a dangerous, abnormally slow heart rate, to the official list of adverse reactions for remdesivir. But the most alarming pharmacovigilance signal came from the kidneys.
We have to talk about the ARIS database, the FDA's own adverse event reporting system, because this is where the biological toxicity seen in the Ebola trial rears its head on a massive scale.
A highly detailed pharmacovigilance analysis was published in 2022 by a team of researchers, Wu et al. They analyzed the data within the FDA's FAIRS database. Specifically, they looked at the reporting odds ratio for acute kidney injury following the administration of remdesivir.
And what did they find?
The findings were severe. Among the safety reports of remdesivir-associated kidney injury, the case fatality proportion was 36.45%.
I want to make sure I'm doing that math correctly. Are you saying that when an acute kidney injury was reported in connection with this drug, more than 1 in 3 of those patients died?
Yes, a 36.45% fatal outcome, and this was corroborated internationally, too. The researchers also analyzed the European database, EudraVigilance, and found a 30.3% fatal outcome for safety reports related to the drug and kidney injury.
Over 36% fatality. And again, these are not numbers pulled from a fringe conspiracy blog.
Right.
This is the FDA's own internal database, analyzed by scientists and published in a peer-reviewed pharmacology journal. Run the biology for me. Why was this drug systematically destroying the kidneys of hospitalized patients?
This brings us to a crucial mechanical understanding of the drug's formulation. Remdesivir is a hydrophobic molecule. It does not naturally dissolve easily in water.
Okay.
Therefore, if you just inject the pure active pharmaceutical ingredient into a patient's bloodstream, it will not dissolve. It won't be transported effectively. It requires a transport vehicle.
So pharmaceutical companies have to mix it with something to carry it through the blood.
Exactly. They use an inactive ingredient called a solubilizer. In the case of remdesivir, the solubilizer is a compound called SBECD. SBECD is a type of cyclodextrin. You can visualize it as a large, cone-shaped sugar molecule.
A cone, got it.
The active drug sits inside the hollow cone. The bloodstream carries the cone to the cells, the drug is delivered, and then the body has to get rid of the empty, heavy cone.
And how does the body filter out the heavy cone?
Through the kidneys. SBECD is excreted almost entirely by renal filtration. Think of your kidney like a delicate, incredibly complex biological coffee filter. If your filter is healthy, the SBECD washes through and is excreted in urine.
But if it's not healthy?
If your kidney function is compromised, the filter is essentially clogged. When you continuously pump massive doses of heavy SBECD cones into a failing filter, they cannot pass through. They accumulate inside the renal tubules, they back up the entire system, causing cellular necrosis, catastrophic toxicity, and rapid acute kidney failure.
So if a patient already has bad kidneys, giving them this drug is like pouring liquid concrete into a clogged drain. And this is where the story shifts from a medical tragedy into a massive legal liability, because the FDA knew about this exact biological risk from day one.
They absolutely knew. It was a well-documented pharmacokinetic reality. When the FDA issued the emergency use authorization on May 1st, they included explicit, legally binding exclusion criteria. The authorization explicitly stated that the drug was not authorized for patients with severe renal impairment.
How did they define severe renal impairment? Was it just a guess?
No, they used a specific biological metric, the eGFR, or estimated glomerular filtration rate. It measures how many milliliters of blood your kidneys filter per minute. The FDA drew a hard line in the sand. The authorization stated the drug was excluded for patients with an eGFR of less than 30. The clinical trials used to authorize the drug had purposefully excluded patients with an eGFR under 30 for this exact reason.
They wrote it directly into the rules. Do not give this to people with an eGFR under 30. But the pharmacovigilance data, the massive spike in acute kidney injuries in the real world, suggests that once the drug hit the hospital floors, backed by the massive NCTAP financial incentives, the hospitals were widely administering it to the exact populations the FDA expressly excluded.
The litigation alleges that hospitals routinely ignored the patient's baseline eGFR lab results, adhered strictly to the financially incentivized COVID protocol, and administered the drug regardless of renal function.
Which changes the legal landscape entirely.
Yeah.
Because giving a drug to a patient with an eGFR under 30, when the label explicitly forbids it, isn't just a doctor making a bad medical call. Legally speaking, it is an unauthorized administration. You are using the drug completely outside the legal bounds of the emergency use authorization.
That is the crux of the modern legal argument, which brings us to the final and most structurally complex piece of this architecture: the litigation wall and the sudden doctrinal opening that is currently shifting the legal landscape in America.
Because if you are listening to this, the obvious screaming question is, if the informed consent fact sheet was systematically missing, if the financial incentives were skewing medical care, if the WHO told them to stop, and if the FDA's own explicit kidney exclusion criteria were being flagrantly crossed, why haven't these wrongful death lawsuits succeeded? Why aren't hospitals paying billions of dollars in damages to these families?
And the answer is an invisible, seemingly impenetrable legal wall called the PRP Act.
Right. Break down the PRP Act for us.
The PRP Act, the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act. To understand this, we have to look at the history of liability shields. In public health emergencies, the government relies on private companies to manufacture vaccines and drugs rapidly, and private hospitals to administer them.
Because the government doesn't have its own hospitals to treat 300 million people.
Exactly, but those private entities will not participate if they fear massive lawsuits for side effects. So Congress enacted the PP Act to grant sweeping immunity from liability.
How broad is the immunity? Is it just a slap on the wrist?
It is nearly absolute. Under the PRP Act, covered persons, which includes doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators, are completely immune from liability when they administer covered countermeasures, such as an EUA drug, during a declared emergency. You cannot sue a hospital for medical malpractice, negligence, or wrongful death regarding a covered countermeasure. The lawsuits are preempted by federal law.
Is there any exception? any way to pierce the shield.
The statute contains exactly one narrow exception: willful misconduct.
But proving willful misconduct in a civil court is almost functionally impossible, isn't it?
It is an incredibly high bar. You essentially have to prove that a doctor or administrator acted intentionally to achieve a wrongful purpose, knowingly without legal or factual justification, and in disregard of a known or obvious risk that is so great as to make it highly probable that the harm will outweigh the benefit.
You basically have to prove the doctor woke up, twirled a mustache, looked at the patient, and intentionally decided to murder them, knowing it was illegal. Proving that kind of malicious intent in the middle of a chaotic ICU during a pandemic is a legal dead end, which is why almost all of the early wrongful death lawsuits brought by families were immediately dismissed by judges.
The hospital simply held up the PREP Act shield, claimed immunity, and the judges threw the cases out.
But something changed.
Yes. The plaintiff's bar, the lawyers representing these families, has pivoted to a new, highly structural legal pathway. It is a brilliant piece of statutory interpretation known as the scope argument.
The scope argument breakdown. For 4 years, the prevailing assumption has been that the PrEP Act provides an impenetrable wall of liability protection for hospitals administering pandemic treatments. When patients died under these protocols, families brought wrongful death suits. Their lawyers typically tried to pierce that protection by pleading willful misconduct, a strategy that almost always fails because the statutory bar for proving intent is so high. But that approach attacks the statute where it is strongest. A tighter strategy ignores exceptions and examines the definition of the law itself. The PrEP Act contains no exceptions for a hospital's failure to obtain informed consent. What it does contain is a rigid boundary establishing which specific actions actually qualify for protection. If a hospital's conduct falls outside the statutory boundary, the facility has no protected status. In this scenario, PrEP Act immunity doesn't need to be broken. Legally, it never attached to the act in the first place. To see where hospitals crossed that boundary, we have to look at the primary treatment used in these cases, remdesivir. In 2018, the drug was deployed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to combat the Ebola virus. The results were poor. Remdesivir was dropped from the trial for clinical inferiority. Data from that study documented a 53% mortality rate and markers indicating significant organ damage. This research was not a private venture. American taxpayers provided approximately $162 million for the drug's development. Despite this investment, the federal government secured no patent rights and no royalty interests from the manufacturer, Gilead Sciences. Remdesivir did not enter 2020 as a promising miracle cure. It was a failed, taxpayer-funded asset sitting in reserve, waiting for a new application. That application materialized during a 96-hour window in April 2020. On April 23rd, the World Health Organization accidentally leaked a draft summary of the Chinese Wang trial, the first rigorous, placebo-controlled study of remdesivir for COVID-19. The leaked findings were clear: no statistically significant clinical benefits. Furthermore, adverse events forced 12% of patients to stop the drug, more than double the rate of the placebo group. Within 24 hours of that leak, the National Institutes of Health executed an abrupt shift. Between April 24th and 27th, just days before the data from their own ACTT-1 trial was unblinded and locked, the agency amended the study protocol. They changed the primary endpoint, the goalpost for success. It shifted from an 8-point scale that prioritized patient mortality to a metric focused simply on time to recovery. Exactly as international data proved the drug was failing to save lives, a federal health agency changed the rules of its own trial so that success no longer required a reduction in deaths. On the morning of April 29th, The Lancet published the Wang trial in full, officially confirming the drug's failure and its link to liver injury. That same afternoon, Anthony Fauci stood in the Oval Office and used the newly adjusted NIH data to declare remdesivir a highly significant new standard of care. The announcement mentioned neither the conflicting Lancet data nor the mid-trial change to the NIH study's endpoints. 2 days later, the FDA issued an emergency use authorization for the drug, relying almost entirely on the preliminary NIH results announced at the White House. In 6 days, a clinically inferior drug bypassed the international consensus of its failure to become a mandated federal protocol. This federal mandate ran directly into a statutory wall. The law governing emergency use authorizations is 21 U.S.C. Section 360 BBB-3. Section 564 of that law establishes a strict condition. Any patient given an unapproved EUA product has a federal statutory right to be informed of their option to refuse it. To comply with this, the FDA created a patient fact sheet, which states, "It is your choice to receive remdesivir or stop it at any time." However, wrongful death lawsuits filed across the country allege a consistent reality. Hospitals admitted patients, administered the drug, and systematically withheld the patient fact sheet. While bodily autonomy was protected on federal paper, the actual choice was removed at the bedside, replaced by a managed hospital protocol. The reason for this shift is found in the federal payment architecture. In March 2020, the CARES Act increased Medicare payments by 20% for any patient diagnosed with COVID-19. In November 2020, the government added a second, more specific layer, the new COVID-19 Treatments Add-on Payment, or NC-TAP. This chart shows the result. A hospital received the standard payment and the 20. By paying facilities per administration, the system structurally disincentivized hospitals from allowing patients to say no. While American hospitals optimized their billing, the rest of the world walked away. In October 2020, the WHO Solidarity Trial, the largest international study ever conducted, found no significant mortality benefit and higher death rates for ventilated patients on remdesivir. On November 20th, the WHO issued a formal guideline recommending against the drug's use. The U.S. government implemented the lucrative NC-TAP payment rule just 18 days before the WHO condemned the drug. Despite the global rejection, the United States continued paying hospitals to use it for 3 more years. The U.S. medical system prioritized a domestic financial architecture over the conclusions of the international scientific community. The damage in the real world was biological. Remdesivir contains a solubilizer called SBECD. Because it is cleared through the kidneys, it aggressively accumulates and becomes toxic in patients with reduced kidney function. Clinical trials originally excluded these patients because their bodies could not clear the drug's solvent. But analysis of the FDA's own safety database shows hospitals were giving the drug to these excluded patients anyway, causing a spike in acute kidney injury. Among these remdesivir-associated kidney injuries reported to the FDA, the fatality rate was 36.45%. More than 1 in 3 patients who suffered this kidney injury died, a direct consequence of hospitals ignoring the clinical exclusions required by the drug's authorization. Given the 36% case fatality rate for kidney injuries and the documented failure to provide the patient fact sheet, we must ask how hospitals continue to utilize the PREP Act to claim immunity. The PREP Act, found at 42 U.S.C. Section 247D6D, only provides immunity for the administration of a covered countermeasure. The law defines a covered countermeasure as a product administered in accordance with Section 564. Authorization under Section 564 depends on 2 strict conditions. The patient must receive the fact sheet, and the facility must honor clinical exclusions, such as those for renal failure. If a hospital fails to provide that sheet or administers the drug to a patient with renal failure, they violate Section 564. In that moment, the drug legally ceased to be a covered countermeasure. Because the conduct was outside the rules of the authorization, the PREP Act immunity never attached to the hospital's actions. For years, the federal government issued advisory opinions that stretched the definition of immunity to protect the medical industry from these claims. That shield was removed in June 2024 by the Supreme Court decision in Loper-Bright v. Raimondo. By overturning the Chevron doctrine, the court ended the practice of deferring to federal agencies. Judges must now follow the strict text of congressional statutes, rather than administrative interpretations designed to protect the industry. We see a failed drug pushed through via altered endpoints, subsidized by targeted payments, and administered systemically without patient consent, all within a system of total administrative control over the patient's body.
Walk me through the mechanics of the scope argument. How do you bypass a federal shield without proving willful misconduct?
You bypass the shield by fundamentally shifting the battlefield. Instead of attacking the shield itself, the lawyers are arguing that the shield never applied to the hospital in the first place. The PRP Act is a conditional statute. It only provides immunity for the administration of a covered countermeasure.
Okay, so how does the law define a covered countermeasure?
That is the key. The PREP Act explicitly defines a covered countermeasure as a product authorized in accordance with Section 564 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act.
Wait, Section 564. That is the exact statute we dissected earlier, the one that houses the strict rules for emergency use authorizations, the one that mandates the patient must be informed of their right to refuse and mandates adherence to the exclusion criteria, like the eGFR kidney function limit.
Exactly. The legal logic flows like a mathematical proof. The PREP Act shield only protects covered countermeasures. A covered countermeasure must be administered in accordance with Section 564.
I see where this is going.
Right. If a hospital failed to provide the patient fact sheet, thereby violating the informed consent requirement of Section 564, or if they administered the drug to a patient with severe renal impairment, violating the EUA's exclusion criteria, then the administration of that drug was not in accordance with Section 564.
Therefore, it ceases to be a covered countermeasure.
Precisely. And if the drug, in that specific instance, is not a covered countermeasure, the PREP Act immunity simply does not apply. The hospital's actions fall completely outside the defined scope of the legal shield.
Let's build an analogy. It's like a reckless driver crashing a car into a pedestrian and then standing in court claiming diplomatic immunity to avoid the lawsuit. The victims try to sue, and the judge says, sorry, my hands are tied, they have diplomatic immunity. But then a sharp lawyer looks at the actual rule book.
And they find a discrepancy.
Right. And the lawyer realizes the driver was in a stolen car, operating outside their permitted zone, and holding an expired passport. The driver never actually qualified for the immunity shields in the first place. The immunity simply doesn't attach to the action. So for years, the legal system said you can't sue because they have a shield. And now lawyers are saying, wait, you never actually earned the shield because you violated the foundational rules of the authorization.
And this scope argument has gained sudden, incredible traction due to a monumental shift in administrative law that occurred very recently at the Supreme Court level. In June 2024, the Supreme Court handed down the Loper-Bright decision.
Loper-Bright. This is an earthquake in the legal world. Explain what the Chevron doctrine was and why killing it changes these lawsuits.
For 40 years, the federal courts operated under a precedent known as the Chevron doctrine. The basic premise was that if a federal statute was vague or ambiguous, judges had to defer to the interpretation of the federal agency enforcing it, agencies like Health and Human Services, HHS, or the FDA.
So the courts deferred to the agencies.
The courts essentially said, we are judges, not scientists or administrators. We will let the agency define the limits of its own power.
And how did HHS use that deference regarding the PREP Act?
Under Chevron deference, the General Counsel for HHS had issued several advisory opinions, basically stating that the PREP Act shield was incredibly broad, covered almost any action related to pandemic response, and protected hospitals almost unconditionally. Because of Chevron, lower courts deferred to that broad, agency-friendly reading and threw out the lawsuit.
But then comes Loper-Bright.
The Loper-Bright decision completely overruled the Chevron doctrine. The Supreme Court declared that courts no longer have to automatically defer to agency interpretations. Judges must now exercise their own independent judgment and read the actual text of the statute themselves.
So those broad HHS advisory opinions that acted like a magic force field for the hospitals suddenly lost their power. They were just opinions now, not binding law.
Exactly.
Suddenly, judges are forced to look at the raw, original text of the PREP Act in Section 564. And when they look at the raw text, they see the exact conditions we've been talking about. They see the informed consent requirement. They see the kidney exclusion criteria.
And the courts are finding that the scope argument is reinforced by several other major foundational constitutional doctrines. It isn't just a statutory trick.
Give me an example of the constitutional backing.
You have the major questions doctrine, recently solidified in West Virginia v. EPA. This doctrine prevents federal agencies from making vast economic and political decisions, like stripping away the medical liability rights of 330 million Americans without explicit, clear congressional authorization.
But Congress never explicitly authorized that.
Congress never explicitly authorized hospitals to bypass informed consent. You also have substantive due process precedents, most notably the Cruzan case at the Supreme Court, which constitutionally protects the right of a competent person to refuse unwanted medical treatment.
And what about the right to actually bring the lawsuit in the first place?
The plaintiffs invoke the Seventh Amendment right to a civil jury trial. They also invoke the Fifth Amendment takings clause. The argument is that a legal cause of action, your right to sue for wrongful death, is a form of property. If the government uses the PRP Act to completely strip away your right to sue, they have taken your property without just compensation.
All of these profound constitutional doctrines are pointing in the exact same direction. The PRP Act cannot be legally interpreted as an absolute unconditional shield for hospitals that flagrantly violated the specific written terms of the FDA authorization.
That is the argument currently making its way through the courts.
So where does this leave the families right now? These scope cases are actively pending in state Supreme Courts and appellate courts across the country. The doctrinal pathways have been blasted wide open by Loper Bright, but they haven't been successfully walked all the way to a final, definitive Supreme Court victory yet.
The litigation wall is cracking.
You can see the light shining through the fissures,
Yeah.
but it hasn't completely collapsed. Which brings us back to the human element of this entire deep dive.
So, what does this all mean? When we synthesize the timeline of the trials, the architecture of the financial ledger, and the incredibly complex mechanics of the legal statutes, what is the final picture we are left with?
It means we watched a system operate in a way that defies common sense, but perfectly aligns with its own incentives. We watched a drug that was formerly pulled from an Ebola trial for being highly toxic and inferior get miraculously revived through a narrow 6-day window.
A window where the math was fundamentally changed.
We watched the National Institutes of Health change the primary mortality-weighted endpoints of a trial midstream, mathematically moving the goalposts just before unlocking the data, completely overshadowing a gold standard Chinese trial that showed the drug failed. We watched that drug get authorized by the FDA with explicit mandatory rules that patients must be given a fact sheet detailing their absolute right to refuse and explicit rules to keep it away from failing kidneys.
And then we watched the federal government build an unprecedented financial architecture. They implemented the CARES Act and the NCTAP, paying hospitals a massive premium, up to 65% above standard costs, if and only if they pumped that specific drug into patients.
And under that immense financial pressure, we watched the legal requirement to inform patients of their right to refuse get systematically bypassed by hospital administrators using generic catch-all admission forms. They kept administering the drug and kept collecting the federal bonuses, even while the World Health Organization screamed at them to stop.
And while the FDA's own databases were flashing red.
Right. The pharmacovigilance databases lit up with a catastrophic 36% fatality rate for acute kidney injuries.
And it is absolutely vital to emphasize how we interpret this. The documentary record does not require us to view this as a story of deliberate mustache-twirling malice by individual frontline doctors.
No, the doctors were just following the protocols handed to them.
Exactly. It is not necessarily a story of a targeted, intentional poison. It is something much more profound. It is a story of catastrophic structural failure.
The system operated exactly as its structural incentives dictated it should.
Yes. The architecture was perfectly designed to protect the pharmaceutical manufacturer's intellectual property and profit margins. It was perfectly designed to protect the hospital's financial solvency during a period of extreme economic crisis. And the PRP Act was perfectly designed to protect the administrative state and the medical facilities from legal liability.
Everyone was protected, except one person.
The only entity the architecture did not protect was the individual patient. It functionally transformed the patient into the bottom row of a spreadsheet, a biological unit required to trigger a cascading series of federal payments.
For you listening to this, we know you are busy. But this is the ultimate aha moment. In a crisis, the public is overwhelmingly told that deferring to authority, trusting the experts, and following the protocol is the highest moral act you can perform. But when you defer blindly, you have to understand the mechanics of the system you are deferring to.
You have to look at the structure.
You have to know who that authority views as the customer and who it views as the product. When the money flows directly from the government to the hospital and the liability shield strictly protects the hospital from your lawsuits, you are not the customer. You are the product.
Recognizing that structural reality should fundamentally alter how we approach the intersection of centralized healthcare policy, financial incentives, and our own bodily autonomy.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to consider long after this deep dive ends. The legal battles over the PRP Act are happening right now. But if this emergency legal and financial architecture remains completely intact, if these wrongful death lawsuits fail and the hospitals are permanently shielded by the courts, What happens during the next declared emergency?
The precedent will have been set in stone.
Exactly. If a hospital administrator knows, based on established legal precedent, that their facility's financial survival depends entirely on federal add-on payments that are tied to one single federally prescribed inflexible medical protocol, will the concept of an individualized second medical opinion even exist in a future crisis? Or will your right to bodily autonomy simply become acceptable collateral damage on a hospital's quarterly spreadsheet?
It is a profound question that the documentary record suggests we must answer before the next crisis inevitably arrives.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We highly encourage you to go look up these public documents, read the CARES Act DRG rules, read the clinical trial designs, and look at the FDA fact sheets for yourself. The records are public, and they are vital. We started this hour talking about an X-ray, looking for a clean break. But when you look closely at the structural architecture of a remdesivir, there is no clean break. Just a massive, complex system operating exactly as it was paid to. Stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
The more you know.
Do when we're feeling sad. Cancel all of our plans, stop responding to text messages, and fall off the face of the earth for about 2 to 3 business days. No.
Welcome, everyone. So I'm in between running around, and I thought I would take some time just to talk to you guys about this, because this is something that I started talking about in 2018, and it kind of fell on deaf ears. And it seems to be an area of control. I mean, this is all a show. We know this, right? But I think it's about time we give him a little bit of pain. Just a little bit of pain. Not all of the pain. I guess a little bit of the pain, right? I want you guys to just take a hot minute for a second. You know, if you have a coffee, a pop drink, if you're drinking alcohol at this time of day, whatever it may be, shut the dog, tell the dog he can shut the door, tell the dog like that he can wait, you know, tell everyone they can wait, take your lunch. You know, if you're at work, have me in your ears and just listen to what I have to tell you in regards to this. Or you can see it later. Because what I walked you through and what I'm about to say is not a hot take, and it's not like a riff. It's not me venting into a microphone. This is the spine of the FAUCI files, right? I want to kind of like lay it on the table the way I would if you were sitting across from me at the kitchen table, the way I would if you were the mother who buried her son she didn't recognize anymore. The wife who watched her husband go into hospital on a Tuesday and never saw him conscious again. The daughter who wasn't allowed in the room when her father died alone on a ventilator with strangers who weren't allowed to give him a hug because the protocol said no. I'm talking to all of you. And I want to start with something that I think is going to be hard for some of you to hear. Because the world has been telling you for 5 years what happened to your loved one was nature, that it was a virus, that it was an act of God, that it was nobody's fault, and there's nobody to be angry at, and you should just grieve and move on and stop being a conspiracy theorist for asking questions. And I'm here to tell you tonight that what happened was not nature. What happened was a protocol. What happened was a policy. And what happened was a decision made by people in rooms with names on dates under legal frameworks that I can name and cite and put a screen and put it in front of a federal judge. And the most important thing, the thing I want to plant into your mind before we lead down anywhere else, is that they took away your right to say no. And they took away the most ancient, the most sacred, the most fundamental right a human being has over their own body, which is the right to be told the truth and the right to consent or to decline. And they got away with it. And I'm going to tell you exactly how they got away with it in my FAUCI Files series. And I'm going to tell you why the lawsuits you've been watching haven't worked. And I'm going to tell you what will work, something that I had been telling all of these attorneys for years. And I'm going to tell you what your role is in all this, because there is one. There is a role for you. There is a road, and it runs through faith, and it runs through love, and it runs through courage. And hopefully by the end of this show, you'll be on the path to know exactly where you need to put your foot. Now, this is really tough for me to go through and explain and say, because I had been saying it. I was extremely distraught at the actions that I was seeing people doing. For those of you that have been listening to me since I was provided a public microphone, rather than just sit in the shadows and write, you'll remember I was fighting with the law. I started with the parents at the school boards, and then that was hijacked. And they created organizations in a way to make money for it. When, I was handing out my debit card so that we can pay for the federal suits. I was trying my best. I was trying to buy time for the lawyers to get on the same page. But a lot of them were handled, and unknowingly, of course. And no matter how many times I would give them the answer to the problem, because it always has to be direct. It's like what we did in the Tina Peters trial. Our amicus steered her case to where it needs to be. Obviously, her attorneys are taking the very slow approach. She should have been out a couple weeks ago. But they're going to do what I suggested, because that's the only legal pathway, some point at the end of May, because Tina's in jail. So what do they care? And, we'll have another crisis and that'll go under, not seen. I like accountability. I mean, I fear it for myself all the time. All of us do. But when you conduct crimes against people to the level that they did, I think it's very important that you hold them accountable so it's not repeated. This is why we had the Nuremberg trials, right? So, in short, let's just start out the gate. The lie they built their house on is what we're going to examine right now. So let's go to the foundation. The foundation of all medical ethics in the modern world, and I mean the foundation, like the bedrock, the thing that's underneath every single piece of human subjects research law on the planet. And mind you, I speak from, what did the lefties say? A point of privilege, right? Because I've actually had human trial certifications. I've actually conducted scientific experiments on humans, wrote a fucking stellar paper. I was systematically being removed. I still have those posters from when I was in college, and I know what it's like to work with IRBs. I know what it takes to get human clinical trial research in, all of that. I know it. So unlike most people, which I'll get to later, that were telling you things, right? Some of them were physicians, but they've never done research in their life. Some of them were nurses, never done research in their life. I actually came from a point of privilege, as the left likes to say, where I've actually done it myself. I've gone to the IRB port. I filed. I told them how I was going to, request consent from the humans that were going to be on the trial. I actually did that. I mean, we were just investigating, obviously, calcification of the upper artery that's in conjunction with people that had certain conditions, and that would indicate, the heart issues that, it was a way that we in radiology would be able to detect calcification of the arteries by looking at abdominal scans. Basically, we wanted to make it protocol for radiologists to, when they're reading, to actually look to see if there's calcification in certain arteries that could be indicators, for such things. And even though those patients already had done those CAT scans that we wanted to use, I still had to formulate an informed consent so that they knew, hey, I'm going to strip all your information. No one's going to see it. I'm going to have it. And I'm going to use these scans from these years to compile my data. Are you okay with that? Obviously, they didn't get any benefit from it. Or some did, actually. But that was it. And this is how it's done. So this is why this show is very important, and more so because, everyone's talking about the deadline, about Fauci and whatever. But I want you guys to know that there are things we can do. There's an amicus that I've crafted. Either I'm going to file it or another organization will. I already wrote it for them. It's perfect. Or I find a New York attorney to file it for me. And there are a few New York-based attorneys. I will come in there not to change the facts of their case. Remember, these attorneys do what they can with the original filings. Once you file a case, it's not like you can create a structure or give the background environment. It's kind of like what we did in the Tina Peters case. All that shit that we put down in the amicus for the Tina Peters case was already in the case. It was in the files. But no one had the, well, they did have the ability before. Tina's counsel did. But recently, let's just say, they didn't have the ability to change things, right? So an amicus is created in order to come in and say, listen, you've got this case, judge, and these are with these two people, but let me give you some structural framework because this affects me. So here's what you need to look at. And basically, what I have, put together on my Fauci file series is pretty much walking you through, and to all those out there that are pending lawsuits, those that have been kicked out, you can refile. You can do it again. Because I talked to a friend of mine that lost her loved one because they gave him remdesivir without asking for permission, and he died. Young guy, they had kids, and she's a widow right now, and they didn't pay anything out, of course, but the doctors got paid, right? The hospital got paid to give him a medication he never had a choice for, because if you remember correctly, it's because they deemed it medically necessary to make the decision. And you would say, but his wife was there. Oh, she was deemed an anti-vaxxer, so they overruled her. It's almost like you know how they snag your kids. This is what we need to look at. So I've written this amicus. It's actually, let me see if I can actually share the screen so I can show it to you before I go any further. Let me see where I have it. Fauci, remdesivir, dossier. Where's my amicus? Where are there balloons? What the hell? Okay. Trying to find a dossier, trying to find, okay. Because I have files and files on this stuff, guys. It's pretty insane. Hold on. All right, here we go. It's in a Word document. Let me open it with Pages. Let me see if I can share it with you too. There we go. This is a draft, by the way. Let me see how I can add it. There we go. I've been working on this for a long time, but this is my draft that I've done. You know, I was thinking of putting it in with thousands of my friends too. But I put down that, you know, this is who I am and this is what I'm filing. And, you know, this is the summary argument. Number one, the conditions of the authorization defect, which clearly I put out how the PREP Act provides immunity only for the administration of a covered countermeasure. I cite the laws. We have the Luper-Bright doctrinal earthquake. We have the pattern of administration to patients meeting EUA exclusion criteria, right? The New York informed consent doctrine, because this amicus, I'm going to have to speak with the attorneys just to let them know what I'm doing. And I have a bunch of organizations and I don't hide things. You know, the only thing I can't talk about is the key TAMs that I've been filing over time. And I put down all the facts of the case. And basically, the argument that I'm making to the court is for them to see it in a different light. I want them to see the structure that they created. They created this architecture. Let me simplify it. WHO decided that they're going to deploy an experiment to investigate how remdesivir responds, right? And they called this the solidarity experiment. Now, within Europe and Africa and other nations that participated, the patients were being told explicitly, hey, you're going to be in a drug trial. This is experimental. You don't have to take it, but if you want to, you can. Now, I don't know how true that is in other nations, but that was the protocol. They only had like tens of thousands participate. The United States did not participate in the solidarity experiment. Now, in the meantime, while they conducted this experiment and we didn't join in, someone, you're welcome, accidentally leaked a paper that the Chinese had showing that remdesivir was no good. And I mean, you didn't even need the Chinese to tell you. We know how it worked with Ebola. This was something that Ron Klain himself knew, hence why him being chief of staff, again, to Biden, Mr. Ebola czar, was very interesting. And if all of you look back into all those years from 2018, where I covered a lot of these healthcare things, like, hey, when you get your consent and treat, say only to consent, because there's fine print. I kept saying that over the years. Now, this is just a repetitive way of me of putting it under there and also not getting myself locked out. I tried in many ways through courts, through back ways where I would talk to your experts that you all paid top dollar to go see talk, and all these events, and lawyers that were filing lawsuits, I would give them my recommendations, and my reputation preceded me. You had the influencers that were making bank on COVID-19, bank, giving you bullshit, tainting me. And this is a strategy that's used. I'm not butthurt, but I am very sad because the outcome could have been extremely different for so many people around the world, and especially in the United States. And therefore, my agitation, the way I express myself sometimes was extremely pedestrian, and that was for a reason. It was also camouflage too. I can't show my teeth yet. Because when they can see that you can bite, and you can bite hard. I mean, a lot of them were stupid. They saw me in places that I shouldn't have been if I was what they said. But hey, they're that smart. But this is important that we go through this, all right? Because as I said, the foundation of all medical ethics around the whole world is just that, right? And it sits underneath every single piece of human subjects research law on planet Earth. Planet Biodome. And it's called the Nuremberg Code. It came out of the trials with the Nazi doctors after the Second World War, right? And the first principle number one, before anything else, is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Again, absolutely essential. Those were the words. Not preferred, not encouraged, not a best practice, not, well, it's a pandemic. It was absolutely essential. Now, that principle was carried into American law through the Belmont Report, right? Through 45 CFR 46, the common rule, through 21 CFR 50, if I misspeak, I'm sorry, which is the FDA informed consent regulation, right? And under, it is the 21 CFR 50, you as a human being are entitled to a description of the research, an explanation of the risks, an explanation of the benefits, an explanation of the alternatives. And I want you to kind of put a pin on that word in your head, alternatives. And you're entitled to know that your participation is voluntary and that you can refuse without any penalty at any time. You could start it and say, fuck this, I'm out. The next day, the next minute, nobody cares. That's American law. That has been American law for decades. That was the American law on January 1st, 2020. That was the American law on March 11th, 2020. Then, at that time, I guess on March 11th, the WHO declared a pandemic. And I want you guys, don't take my word for it, because a lot of you are going to be like, no. I did tell you all of this in February and March of 2020, the majority of it, how everyone's going to get AIDS, how they're going to give you HIV, how it's all manufactured, how the 33 adenine tails were there, how they use graphene oxide to seam it together to create it, to create it. Because, I've said this before, and this is where it really hurts sometimes, is that I've actually delved in a lot of medical experimentation. I can myself conduct experiments with SCAMP technology, SCNT, which is pretty much genetic modification. I actually have these skills. I'm not just saying it. And I understand these very well. And I explained it in pieces, disconnected, because I was actually very targeted in 2020, extremely targeted. And I don't care what anybody says. None of you motherfuckers had all your bank accounts shut down. None of you had friends poisoning you, okay? None of you had things that I haven't even spoken of publicly ever happen, right? None of you have had the smear campaigns that I have had against my person. So take that to the bank. Now into the nitty gritty. Here's what they did. They invoked a structure called the Emergency Use Authorization. That's 21 USC 360 BBB-3. I remember the BBB is Better Business Bureau, but it's not. And they used it as a doorway, basically. The EUA statute, the Emergency Utilization Authorization Act, under Emergency Act, whatever statute, is actually a real statute, right? It exists for a reason. It's supposed to allow the rapid deployment of countermeasures in a true emergency. But buried in that statute is a condition. And the condition is that the recipients of the EUA product be informed of the option to accept or refuse the product, be informed of the consequences of refusal, and be informed of the alternatives. Now, if you remember, when that all came out, I did a whole show. I told you, nope, all they did was the name. They didn't even do the content. They only did the name. And you had legacy media and leftist journalists, and then the right wing countering with like snake venom. And you had, Dr. Jane Ruby coming out with graphene oxide. Where'd she get that from? And they were giving you all this shit, and they were telling you what you need to take. They were telling you what you need to do. Remember how the right wing, they made fucking bank. Not just the pharmaceutical companies, not just Fauci, not just government employees, not just Senate, not just Congress, not just hospitals, doctors, nurses, and that. Your alternative media took your money that you were giving them so that they can help you. When, in essence, they were effectively making you ineffective and stupider and dumber, and to pull further away from the solutions. I mean, the proof is in the pudding, bitches. Our amicus got President Trump sorted with the Colorado Supreme Court debacle, if you remember, because out of all these, ooh, we love Trump, look at us, and all these people with a shit ton of money and apparently a shit ton of brains didn't even think to argue jurisdiction. We were the only ones that did it. And that's the only reason that I filed it and slaved over getting it done, because none of those idiots did it. Same thing for the amicus and Tina. No idiot decided to do it. No one ever talked about it, right? Because they knew better, right? Look at me. I'm popular. Like, listen to me. Like, bitch, you don't know me. When I would tell them, you need to look at this, they would tell me, we have a strategy that doesn't fit. I don't understand it. But my strategy is so ironclad that maybe this New York case may pivot hard and give the opportunity for others to come back and claim. Now, like I said, those were the rules. You had to know that you can refuse. You had to know what the consequences of you refusing are, and you had to be informed of the alternative. Let's be fair. Those that refused in hospital were then becoming wardens, like the hospital was becoming wards over them. If the family said no, then they would make it extremely difficult to care for them. And alternatives, that's a conspiracy theory. There's that word again, alternatives, that I told you to mark, right? Now, I want to ask yourself a question. When your loved one was admitted into the hospital in 2020 or 2021, were they handed a piece of paper that said, you have the right to refuse this drug? Here are the consequences of refusing it. And here are the alternative treatments available to you. Were they? Was your father, your mother, your husband, your friend, your wife, your kid? Now I'm going to answer that for you, because I've read the discharge protocols. I've read the hospital orders. I've read the federal advisories that went to every health system in the country. No, they were not. They were not given a piece of paper. They were not told there were alternatives. They were not told that they could refuse. They were not told there was one protocol. Well, no, they were actually told there was only one protocol, actually. And that protocol was the protocol. And the protocol, what was happening. That's it. There's one protocol. That's what we're doing. Tough shit. No alternates. No paper. Now, that's not consent. That's coercion under the color of law. And it was done in the name of an emergency. And it was done at scale. And it was done with the full force and authority of the federal government behind it. And the people who designed the framework knew exactly what they were doing. This is the lie they built the house on. And every single death, every single injury, every single grandmother who died alone, every single father, mother, granddad who got intubated and never came home, every single child whose parent didn't come home, and even children that never came home, every one of those is sitting on top of that lie, not the virus, the lie about consent. Hold that. Because I think I need to take you a little bit deeper. Now, I want to tell you something that almost nobody in any media space has put together. And I want you to listen very, very carefully, because this is the heart of the FAUCI files. There was, in March 2020, an international clinical trial launched by the World Health Organization, what I said earlier. And it was called the Solidarity Trial. Fuck, a communist name for a drug trial. Why not, right? Solidarity. Solidarity. That means standing together. That word means, being in this with one another, in it together. Remember that messaging. That word means no one fights alone. No one's alone. The Solidarity Trial enrolled patients in dozens of countries around the world. It tested 4 treatment arms against the standard of care: remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, and ritonavir, right? And interferon, right? And here's the thing I want you to understand about how the trial worked. Patients in the Solidarity Trial were enrolled, which means they were informed, which means they were given a consent form, which means they were told what was being studied, what the alternatives were, and that they had the right to participate or decline if they decided they would still take the standard of care. If they decided they just want to do their own care or declined, being in the trial. Now, here's the thing. If they declined being in the trial, they still got standard care in the United States. If you put your foot down on remdesivir, you just died. Or they would discharge you. Or they would bring the police and take away your wife or husband or daughter or son for fighting the doctors on the medication. Now, again, that was happening in other countries. Patients in France, Argentina, South Africa, Norway, Indonesia, they had a choice. They could enter the trial. They could decline the trial. They could ask their doctor about, other things. They had options. They had agency. They had what the WHO itself called solidarity. They were standing together as informed human beings, making informed decisions about their own bodies in the middle of a global health event. Whereas they had no choice on the vaccine, though. We did a little bit, but, roles reversed. Now, the United States, as I said, didn't participate in the solidarity at a patient level. The United States actually ran its own framework. It ran the EUA framework. And under the EUA framework, patients in American hospitals were not enrolled in a clinical trial with informed consent. They were given an authorized product under emergency authorization and the informed consent provision of the UAE statute, the one I just told you about, was treated as paperwork formality, or in many cases was waived entirely, or buried in admission paperwork that nobody read because their loved one was struggling to breathe. So here's what I want you to hear. And I want you to hear it slow because the wordplay matters. And I built it on purpose. They did not put us in the solidarity experiment. They put us in the solitary experiment. Solitary, like a prison cell, like solitary confinement, like a place where you're alone, where you have no choices, where the door is locked from the outside, and where someone else makes all the decisions about what happens to your body. That was the American framework. That was what they did to your father, your mother, your grandfather, your grandmother, your children, your brothers, your sisters, and your friends. That was what they did to your husband. That is what they did to your child. Everything. They put him in solitary without telling them, without offering them solidarity, without offering them the trial, without offering them alternatives, without offering them the choice. And do you know why they did that? Do you know why the United States, of all the developed countries on earth, did not enroll citizens in solidarity? Because they knew. They knew what would happen if you put real informed consent in front of an American mother and an American father, and you said, "We like to enroll your child in an experimental trial of a drug whose long-term safety is unknown." Actually, they did know through Ebola that it increased fatality. Like over 56% of the people died on fucking that drug. But let me digress. No, we won't. No, we won't. So, what if they put that? "We'd like to enroll your child in an experimental trial of a drug whose long-term safety is unknown. You may decline. There are alternatives." They knew what an American family would say. They would say, "Fuck you, pound sand. I'm not doing it. I'm not a guinea pig." They knew Americans, given the choice, given the truth, given the alternatives, would decline experimental drugs. Many of them, maybe most of them. So they didn't give us the choice. They concealed it. They lied. They wrote it out of paperwork. They folded it into emergency authority, and they used the panic over the absence of consent. That's what's happened. I'm not speculating. I'm reading the statutory framework against the operational record. And it's plain and simple, okay? This is why Fauci files, right? The first one is the 6-window day, because it was also fast too. Faster than the law allowed, faster than the ethics allow, faster than the conscience of any honest physician could keep up with. And it was fast on purpose. Speed was the cover. Emergency was the cover. Solitary was the cover. We never got solidarity. Other people did, but we didn't. We got solitaire. That's what we got. That's exactly what we got. So now, speaking about all these things, I think it's important that I bring up, PB for a second, because he made some stellar remarks, and I want you guys to listen to this.
Antivirus. Everybody's kind of minding their own business, and then we start seeing these clips again on ships. Hey, this person died, that person died, and then this same guy, Tedros, comes back up, and people are like, wait a minute, that guy's back up again? Yes. What is really the headline of this story? A luxury cruise ship carrying 147 passengers sailing towards Canary Island with a confirmed Andes hantavirus outbreak. On board, 3 dead, 8 cases, and the only known hantavirus strain that spreads person to person. The World Health Organization has deployed an expert on board, shipping 2,500 diagnostic kits to 5 countries, and says this is not the next COVID. They're already saying that up front to not scare the crap out of people. But with no approved vaccine, no approved treatment, with a 38% kill rate, the world is paying attention. And by the way, the states that they're looking at, that they're literally following the people that were tied to it, was Georgia, 2 residents monitored, Arizona, 1 resident flagged by Arizona Department of Health and Services, California, an undisclosed number of residents under CDC coordinated observation. But the CDC stated, again, this is important because we don't want to do fear porn here, and maybe others are going to be doing that. The risk to the American public at this time is extremely low. You know what's the scary part of that sentence? At this time, okay? So with that being said, Rob, if you got a couple of the clips to play before I go to, let's start off with Tedros. If you don't remember him,
oh man,
he was the guy that was the director general of CDC, and here's what he had to say. Go for it, Rob.
8 cases have been reported, including 3 deaths. 5 of the 8 cases have been confirmed as hantavirus.
bird watching, and oh, wait a minute, is that rat waving his butt at me? I don't know. Let me sniff.
Benny, continue.
You're right. It is a
We lost
rat.
time. We lost time for a second.
But I get the story that it's just an unbelievable story that they're still going to try to use it on us, and to hell with them. It's not going to work. So right now the ship is actually headed to the Canary Islands, Pat. The ETA is May 11th. And weird, what's 11th? May 11th, Rob? That's the date of Fauci's deadline for his 5-year, what's it called? Statute of limitations for him.
Rob, your audio is off.
Yeah,
Your
so
mic
meanwhile,
is off.
passengers have already left the ship. Guys, this is what drives me crazy. They've been dropping passengers off left and right. They're scattered all over the place in different countries, thinking that they're fine. And mind you, it takes 8 weeks, Pat, up to 8 weeks for this to actually give you some symptoms. And
They say.
Yeah, they say. And another little fun fact, Rob, maybe you could look this up. The hantavirus is listed in Pfizer's 38-page document on page 33. Guess what one of the side effects is? The hantavirus. Weird. A vaccine that they pushed on everybody, one of the side effects is the virus. It's in there. Oh, isn't that weird? So now they're looking into the situation saying, look, they're telling us that this could possibly be a side effect connected with COVID. Weird. And then you find out another fun fact. Moderna and the Korea University are already working on a mRNA hantavirus vaccine from 2024. Again, maybe it's normal research. Maybe they're preparing for threats, just like Bill Gates has been warning us, and there's videos of Fauci warning us like they're freaking psychics. Okay?
Interesting. Look at these side effects here. May cause pulmonary distress, may cause stock to go up.
Oh, weird.
Interesting. Right there in the side effects.
Very interesting. And then Gene Hackman. Do you guys remember Gene Hackman's wife?
Of course.
Who passed away? She died of a hantavirus. And everybody.
Well, they both died, right? And they were
both
found
died.
like a week later, tragically. Right?
Yeah, and the dogs were, somebody killed the dogs
it was
as well.
terrible.
Which puts the virus back in the public conversation. And then this is a random one, Rob. In 2022, Pat, a guy or an account called Soothsayer posted this. He posted, it in 2022, he posted this. 2023, Corona ended. 2026, hantavirus. This is in 1:30 in the morning. Maybe he had maybe Fauci was visiting him or something. June 11th in 2022, he posts that. And this is the problem, Pat. After COVID.
Wait, who tweeted that?
So a guy named Soothsayer. Might be a guy, might be a girl. He did that in 2022.
Oh, he gets wide coverage. Look at the stats there.
Z.
Go on his account, Rob, just to see if he's done other things. Okay, he's 59,400. Who is he?
I don't even know.
Reads the future? What? Go back to the tweet.
Pat, he's an astrologist, so you know everything he says is accurate.
So 2023, Corona ended. He posted that on June 11, 2022 at 1:30 a.m. And in 2026, he says antivirus is going to come.
Yeah.
Is that Fauci's burner account?
Or Bill Gates.
Yeah.
And it's just, and this is what it is, Pat. And this is the scary thing, or not the scary, it's the sad thing, kind of combined of both. They screwed with us so much. They did so much damage, and we're going to get to Fauci. Even if this is real, we don't believe you. Okay? You have lost your credibility, every single one of you. When you silence people like Peter McCullough, when you silence people like, who was the other guy, Rob, with the beard?
Robert Malone.
Robert Malone. These are people
Great
that were
beard.
telling us, like, guys, this is what's happening. Early detection. We can help all you people. They lied. They censored people. They kicked people off of YouTube. They try to lock people up because of this. And it's absolutely, like, blindly trusting the WHO. And there's a great clip. Pat, can I just touch on Fauci really fast?
Yeah, for sure.
Fauci, May 11th, weird, when the ship is about to dock. It's coming up on his 5-year statute of limitation. This is what I want people to understand about Mr. Fauci. And Peter McCullough says why he needs to get locked up and the crimes, the 2 major crimes. And if you're out there and you're listening, you have family members that passed away, couldn't see family members when they died, or you're dealing with a family member, potentially a young son of yours, or a cousin, or a nephew that has freaking myocarditis, it's because of him. Okay, so Rob, please play this Sage clip with Dr. McCullough.
It's our girl Sage Steele.
Anthony Fauci right now today.
I would say that a man who seeks 10 years of clemency.
He asked for it, Pat.
Which he did, by the way, to get a pardon. It's not handed out without a request.
He asked for it.
Approached Biden for 10 years pardon for crimes he knew he committed.
Bingo.
He knew he committed. That's the reason why he asked for clemency. I would tell him, listen, the world understands that Fauci has committed 2 crimes.
Here we go.
One is fraudulent concealment. He intentionally concealed the origins of SARS-CoV-2 from his funded projects in Wuhan. It's fraudulent concealment. If we would have known what the story was originally, I think we could have done better in our pandemic response. And the second major crime I think he committed is mass negligent homicide by 2 mechanisms. 2 mechanisms. First, he worked to suppress our efforts at publishing and promulgating early treatment protocols, which worked to get people through the illness. And secondly, he relentlessly promoted unsafe vaccines that took hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of lives worldwide. It's been the greatest biological catastrophe mankind has ever seen. And largely, Fauci is responsible for orchestrating this on the world.
And by the way, you heard what he said, Pat? So fraudulent concealment. Guys, when everybody was like, bat, wet market, he knew where it came from.
Yes, he did. So did I. So did many people. So did the president. But unfortunately, the 25th Amendment was being floated the minute he started talking about alternative remedies. And this is why, when he left publicly, we let them think Biden was in charge. Because if a pen signs clemencies, who read the clemency application when Biden was not in the process of doing it? Now, a lot of things happened that shouldn't have happened, that caused delays, a lot of delays. And I'm going to say this straight. While the globalists and the 4th unelected branch of government are fucking insane, okay? And the lefties, unfortunately, are extremely brainwashed. And some of the most educated people are on that list. It was the truther movement that actually was the problem, because they were pulling people in multiple directions. They were slandering those that were putting out actual information. They were grabbing bigger microphones. They had bigger sponsors. And I did put a little, kind of video. I've been working on this for a very long time. But when I show you that the sponsorships all lead back to the same pocketbook, some of them actually overlap. Your favorite people that you watch have sponsors that are shared with Medias Touch and Democracy Now! What? Oh, and the WHO funds some of that. And these are the people that were selling you Z-Packs, that have advertisements everywhere, that were making serious dough, that were creating these events. Come, let's talk about health. The doctors and the nurses were none the wiser. They just wanted to talk about their perspective and what to go. We'll get into that. So I suggest you watch that. Don't agree with everything they're saying, but I agree with the majority of it. Okay. Now, as I said, President Trump's hands were tied, and I want to address that head on because I know my audience, and I know there's people listening to me right now who voted for Donald J. Trump, who were angry at Donald J. Trump about Operation Warp Speed, who feel betrayed, who feel confused, who feel like if you're going to come for Fauci, you better come for Trump too. And I totally hear you. I hear you, and I love you, and I'm not going to lie to you. Because I have watched this administrative state for a very long time. I was part of our administrative state for a very long time. And I actually know how it works. The president of the United States, any president, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter, doesn't actually run the federal health bureaucracy on a day-to-day operational basis. He doesn't write the protocol that goes out to the hospital in Toledo. He doesn't sign off on the language in the EUA fact sheet. He doesn't call the head of the NIAID and tell them what study to fund. The president sits on top of an enormous, deeply entrenched career civil service apparatus that spans the National Institute of Health, the Centers of Disease Control, and Congress does the private CDC. That's another topic. The FDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, right? The Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, and the dense web of contractor relationships, advisory committees, and grant pipelines that have been built up over 40, 60, 70 years. That apparatus is not loyal to any president. That apparatus is loyal to itself. It is loyal to its grant flows. It's loyal to its pharmaceutical partners. It's loyal to the specific scientific and ideological commitments of the people who have run it for decades. It is the fourth unelected branch of government. Now, Anthony Fauci was the head of the NIAID for 38 fucking years. 38 fucking years. He served 7 presidents. He outlasted all the fuckers. Think about what that means. Think about who actually had the institutional power for you. Black pillars, it's Trump's fault. Fuck you, right? There's procedures that don't let him intervene. Now, Donald Trump came into the White House in January of 2017. He was, from the moment he took the oath, the target of one of the most coordinated bureaucratic resistance in modern American history. Let me not say the world. There were leaks. There were sabotage appointments. There were career officials who openly bragged about being part of a resistance from inside. There were impeachments. There were 25th Amendments. There was Russiagate. There was Russia hoax. There was SCOTUS hoax. There were investigations. By the time the COVID emergency hit in early 2020, the operational levels of the federal health response were not in the president's hand. They were in the hands of people who had built the framework. Fauci, Birx, Amy fucking Acton running for governor in Ohio, Collins, the senior career staff at HHS, the advisory committees, the career attorneys at the FDA who write the EUAs. The president can give a press conference. The president can ask questions in front of the cameras, and you saw him do it. You saw him ask about hydroxychloroquine. You saw him ask about ivermectin. You saw him ask about other therapeutics. You saw him ask why we couldn't just send people home with treatment instead of waiting for them to be sick enough to be hospitalized. You saw the press destroy him for asking. You saw the doctors lose their licenses for prescribing the alternatives he was asking about. His hands were tied. They were tied with bureaucratic rope. They were tied with media rope. They were tied with legal rope. And they were tied with emergency framework that the moment it was invoked under the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, the PREP Act, handed the operational machinery to the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the career officials beneath him, not to the Oval Office. So for all you stupid ass fuckers, pound sand. Now, I'm not saying this absolves the president, and I'm not saying mistakes weren't made. I'm saying if you're going to do an honest structural analysis and flap your mouth for coin, you have to look at actually who did the steering of the wheel. And on the day that informed consent died in this country, the steering wheel was not in the Oval Office. It was at the NIAID. It was at the FDA. It was at the inside of the framework that had been built over decades to be functionally autonomous from elected accountability. That is the structure. That's the truth. And if we don't name the structure, I mean, we can't fix it, can we? I mean, you need to call a demon by its name. So that's what's up. So I have said this. I've said it in a more casual language. I said it over the years. I even wrote an article in 2020, April, before it was signed, that the Hippocratic Oath is gone out the fucking window, right? When I saw that the patient, a guy, that's what did it for me. And remember, none of you motherfuckers would have known that they get paid for COVID patients if I didn't fucking pop that. So many times I'd been trying to put it out there, so many times. And I think maybe this is opportune time where people can actually listen. Even though all the coffees you guys sent me, I pay to boost my shit on X. I've boosted it right now. You know, the $75, and I'm not seeing a boost. I see 3,000 people. On the back end, I can see that I get 250,000 people watching me, and it's not showing. They take my money and I don't get a boost because they don't want me to talk, because there's a lot of money involved. And they know from the series that I just started, not the Fauci one, we're talking the other one too. I've started getting Arabella Network and Vanguard, and wait till the Fauci files, because I'm going to show you who's been paying all these motherfuckers. You saw the legacy media brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Pfizer. But did you see the Ann Vandersteel brought to you by? No? Did you see these events that they were hosting, the brought to you by? Oh, they might have had some name, right? But who was that name? And where was that name getting the money from? That's all in the Fauci file, just so you know. And this is why I don't play nice with people. Now, we called the demon by its name, the structure, right? Now, I'm going to tell you why the lawsuits haven't really worked. And I know some of you have been waiting for the courts to fix this. I know a lot of attorneys that are mine too have just been gutted, knowing that this is wrong, knowing that they did everything they could and still lose. Now, I know some of you have given money to legal funds. I know some of you have followed every filing of every lawyer who has gotten on a podcast and promised this case was going to be the one. And I know how it felt to watch case after case get dismissed on standing, dismissed on PREP Act, dismissed on sovereign immunity, dismissed on statute of limitation, dismissed on political question doctrine, dismissed and dismissed and dismissed. And I want to tell you why. Because I love you, and I'm not going to let you keep banging your head up against the wall without telling you why the wall is built the way it's built. The lawsuits by large have failed because they had not been built on structural analysis. This is why my amicuses are correct. And this is why the amicus that I filed in with all of you in the Supreme Court when President Trump was going to trial with the state of Colorado was successful. Structural analysis is key. Right? When you're a judge, you're looking at two papers that have been filed and you get some context of what it is. Now, a judge, especially in something heated like this and very politically charged, okay, can't sit there and put his 2 cents in it. He has to work with what they give him. So we've got the really nasty ones and the other ones, and it's like, but nobody talks about the structural analysis. And this is why I feel that these amicuses on those cases that are still viable, I need to file in every single one of them. Tailor-made for each case, of course, which is a hell of a lot of work. Writing this amicus for the New York case took me a while. And so I've approached an organization to see if they would file it, because I did all the work. I did all the citations, as you saw. I've done everything. And obviously they're the attorneys, because I can probably file it pro se in New York, to be fair. And I was thinking of doing it just like I did for those guys that got, done in for, the elections and the slate of electors. No one's helping them. They're not making money off of talking about them. So why bother with them, right? That's how your media works, if you're paying attention. So I do love you guys. And I love every single human being. I think all of us have the right to the truth. Now, structural analysis. None of them have been built on structural analysis. They've just been emotionally charged and built on outrage. They've been built on gut conviction that what happened was wrong, which is accurate. And what happened was wrong. But wrong is not a cause of action. Wrong is not a legal theory. Wrong is not a brief. To win in federal court, you have to do 3 things, right? You have to establish standing, meaning you specifically suffered a concrete and particularized injury that is traceable to you and redressable by the court. And this is why my IRS lawsuit to abolish the IRS is taking a while, because I'm stuck on the standing. But I think I may have found a segue that may put me in harm's way, but I'm more than ready for the punches. I'm going to go to the gym so I can be ready for that. Now, that's one thing, you have to understand, that there is a structure and that you have to do that. So that's number 1, right? You have to overcome immunity, meaning you have to actually find a path around the PREP Act, right? Around qualified immunity, around sovereign immunity, around the Federal Tort Claims Act exclusions and all that. Now, I did a lot of that testing when I was filing lawsuits, against Mark Elias, against a bunch of people, senators, congressmen that were served. That helped me see the response and see how it worked. And obviously I had attorneys that were in it for clout. Where are they now? Segments. It's like those videos you see on Facebook, but not to actually do. It felt lackluster, and it was okay because we were learning. This hasn't been done, and none of the great legal minds that I approach and none of the people that I was able to communicate with even entertained this. So I had to do something, right? Anyway, once you do that, you have to identify a cause of action, meaning you have to fit your harm into like this little box of legalese that the law recognizes, right? So now most of the lawsuits I've watched have failed because the lawyer in question identified a defendant, a hospital, a pharmaceutical company, and a federal official, and tried to sue that defendant for that harm in isolation without putting the framework underneath it on the record. They went for the symptom. They didn't go for the structure, right? And that's the problem. And I kept saying it, and they were all looking, maybe it's the lawyer ego. I don't know, right? It's whatever. And here's where I have to be very direct with you about something. And I'm going to be direct because I do care about you. While you're suing, and I mean while, in the present continuance tense, while a case is alive and pending, there is an enormous limitation on what your attorney can put before the court. There are rules of civil procedure. There are pleading standards. There are page limits. There are issues you can't raise because they weren't raised before or below, whatever. There are constitutional questions that lower courts can't reach. There is a profound structural inability of a single plaintiff in a single case to put the entire architecture of what happened in front of a judge. And that is why my amicus curiae briefs matter so much. Amicus curiae, friend of the court. An amicus brief is filed by someone who is not party to the case, but who may have expertise or experience or structural perspective that the court needs in order to understand the full landscape of what's being decided. So an amicus brief can raise the constitutional questions the parties can't reach. An amicus brief can put the framework on the record. An amicus brief can connect this case to that case or to that case and show the court and show the public, because amicus briefs are public. The pattern that any individual plaintiff is structurally unable to show. So your attorneys can't do this, right? This is why I've spent so much time and effort, even on the Peters versus Fain matter. This is why, I put an amicus in that. This is why I work with attorneys like Grant Giat, because I understand, and I want you to understand tonight, that the structural fight is not won by one plaintiff with one lawyer in one courtroom. It's won by building the record across cases, by filing amicuses where the constitutional questions live, by making sure the framework is on paper, in the docket, citable by the next court and the next court and the next court. So, if you've lost someone, if you've been injured, if you have stories, your story does matter. Your story matters more than you know, but it matters in a structural way. It matters because it can be part of the record. It matters because it can be cited in the amicus. It matters because the framework I have just walked you through tonight, right? The consent framework, the EUA, the framework will not be fixed by one verdict. It'll be fixed by a slow, patient, sustained structural campaign to put the architecture on the record and force the courts and Congress to confront it. Now, I have been doing as much as I can, but I can't force attorneys to do things. And I want to express that. And anytime I had raised those questions to events that had invited me to talk about COVID, because, I'm actually brick and mortar educated in these things, I was actually blacklisted to not talk about this, to not talk about the fact that on a legal way we need to, and I want to say blacklisted, meaning the fuckers didn't call me back. Though, keep in mind, for the past 10, 11 months, motherfuckers have been pounding my phone and they've been put into my spam folder, just so you understand. Because I'm a person that will give you all the chances in the world. But the minute I decide to cut you off, you're at Satan's mercy, not God's. So just going to put that out there. Now, having said that, that is the road. That is the road. There's no other road. And, and I'm going to go walk that road. And I'm asking whoever wants to, they can walk it with me. Okay. Now, I also want to talk about the part of you that's not like the legal mind, set here. I want to talk to the part of you that's, the heart. Because some of you have been carrying something for 5 years that you haven't been allowed to put down. You've been carrying grief, and on top of the grief, you've been carrying anger, and on top of the anger, you've been carrying confusion, and on top of the confusion, you've been carrying isolation, because the world told you that you were crazy for asking questions about what happened to the person you love. And I'm telling you tonight, you're not crazy. I mean, right now, my daughter's in the state court here in Ohio fighting about the mask mandates. I won't give up. Even though we've spent almost $500,000 on that topic, I won't give up. And it could have been done if these people did not create Moms for America and bullshit and fucking taint the whole fucking scene. The shit that idiots, oh my God, I'm getting very mad now. Idiots like Brian Cates and whoever else is under that fucking network's NDA were saying that I was doing wrong. Bitches, I was trying to fix everything. You guys were just on a pay. Fuck you. Excuse my French. God, I get so angry. I get really, really angry when I remember the audacity, because they didn't understand just the gravity of what they were doing. They were allowing murder, or how they say indirect or involuntary manslaughter, of thousands of Americans daily. And they were looking at their numbers on Twitter and fucking YouTube and thumping their friends about bullshit and venom, while I actually had the solutions. And whatever I did, they took and they fucked it up when we were actually getting somewhere. We filed federal lawsuits across 50 fucking states. And what did they do? They went and tried to do the same and tainted and did. None of them helped. All these people that were holding events and made millions of dollars, where the fuck were they? I don't want to derail myself. I got a Zen. Actually, you know what? I have a video for that. The way I feel right now, I got a video for that. Hold on.
My manners today, and I said please. Well, actually, I said bitch please, but that doesn't matter.
Bitch, please. Yes. Now, none of you were crazy. All of you were right. You were right to ask. You were right to be angry. You were right to say, holy shit, the inserts in the COVID vaccine were fucking blank. If the vaccine inserts were blank, imagine the patients that walked in there not being able to breathe and flustered. What blank shit they had? Nothing. It was a blanket. Oh, you signed a consent decree. That's not being part of this fucking experiment. Yeah, no. You saw it and you signed. No, I'm not signing that. Oh, you're not signing that. I think the wife, we need to take her away. She's working against the interests of the patients. We need to get her, give him remdesivir. Oh shit, he died. Yeah, sorry, ma'am. I told you he was going to die. Fuck you, ma'am. This is what all of us scientists say. But at the bottom line, I'm going to tell you how it went. The doctor was told, you don't fucking do this shit, you're getting fired. Your malpractice insurance, I am paying that bitch. You want to make money? Let's go. I mean, we were following what South Park said, that Mickey Mouse and fucking so-and-so were fucking a bat in the wet market, and that's how COVID came. We stooped down to fucking South Park level, right? Rather than the science that I had laid out in the beginning of March, right? Right before my birthday. The science, where I told you how they created it. They had to use graphene oxide because it's biointegratable and also has RFID properties. That's how they could check if you've got COVID shots or not. And that is how the hantavirus kicks. But that's another story. We're not getting into the science today. We're going to stick to the law. Okay. But, whew. Now, all of your instincts were correct. And as you know, the gaslighting that was done to you by the press, by public health authorities, by people in your own family who told you to stop asking or shamed you for it, you know, by asking, your friends for advice and them shaming you. But what about the platforms that took all the posts down? All of that was secondary injury laid on top of the first. And I see it. I want you to know that I see it. But faith here is important, like real faith, not bumper sticker faith, not the faith that says God will fix it if you just smile harder, right? The faith that the Psalms talk about, the faith of that woman at the foot of the cross, the faith of the mother who buries her child and gets up the next morning and still walks, the faith of the woman going to the judge asking for help until one day he's like, what do you want? I'm talking about that kind of faith. The kind of faith that is not the absence of grief. It is the companion of grief. It is the thing that walks beside you when you're walking through the valley you didn't fucking choose. And I want to say about faith right now is this, that people who lied to you don't get to take your faith from you. They took your consent. They took your loved one. They took, in many cases, your trust. They don't take your faith. Your faith is yours. Your relationship with whatever you call holy, your God, your ancestors, your conscience, your whatever. The still small voice that you hear when you're alone, that's yours. They can't get to it. They can't reach it. It's the part of you they can't legislate, they can't regulate, can't put under emergency authority, can't lock in solitary, right? So always hold it. Because with that, you have love that you carry for the person you lost as not a wound, but as a witness. It's the proof that they were here. It is the proof that they mattered. It is the proof that what was done to them was done to a person with a name who was loved and not a statistic, not a case number, not a line on the HHS dashboard, not at the bottom of the ledger. Your love is the antidote to the depersonalization that the system did to your loved one. When you say their name, you defeat the system. When you tell their story, you defeat the system. When you refuse to let them be reduced to a number, you defeat the system. Love is structural. Love is the most subversive thing you can bring into this fight. So you should be bringing that shit, okay? All of it. But courage, right? I'm going to ask you to do something that's going to be hard. I'm going to ask you to speak. I'm going to ask you to write down what happened to your person. I'm going to ask you to put the dates, the hospital, the protocol they were placed on, the information you were given, the information you were not given, whether anyone presented you with a consent form, whether you were told about alternatives, or whether you were allowed in the room. I'm going to ask you to preserve it. Original, dates, names, documents, photographs, voicemail, text messages, hospital, anything you have, preserve it. Why didn't you tell us before? I did. I just didn't say it like this, because then I wouldn't be here right now. And I'm going to ask you to also be ready, because a structural campaign I described to you, right, runs on stories. It runs on records. It runs on witnesses. And every time one of you stands up and says, this is what happened to my husband, here are the dates, here are the documents, you become part of the record. You become a witness. You become a citizen historian of what they did. That takes courage. It takes courage because the world has been telling you to be quiet. It takes courage because telling the story makes you relive the loss. It takes courage because some of your own family members may not be ready to hear it. I know. I fucking know. But faith, love, and courage are the three legs of the stool. Faith holds you up when there's no evidence. Love is what you fight for, and courage is what you, out of the chair and to the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen, put down. Faith, love, courage. If you have these three things, you have everything. Never ask. It's because you said so. But here's the bottom on this, all right? They took our right to consent and got away with it because they used emergency authority as cover. They put us in solitary while other countries got solidarity, because they knew that if we had been told the truth and given alternatives, we would have said no. They concealed it, they lied, and the bureaucratic apparatus that did this is structurally insulated from elected accountability, which is why the president's hands were tied, and which is why a single lawsuit against a single hospital with a single plaintiff has not and will not and cannot dismantle this framework. The dismantling happens through structural analysis. It happens through amicus filings that put the architecture on the record. It happens through preserving evidence. It happens through telling stories. It happens through citizen historians and citizen witnesses. You have the pen of history and start writing. Citizen petitioners showing up across courtrooms, across districts, across circuits, until the framework is on paper in front of every federal judge in this country, and they can't pretend they don't see it. This is why we filed in 50 states, remember? It's going to take time, because I was completely derailed with many actions that were done upon me that a lot of you don't even know happened. Some people listening to me right now will probably not even be alive to see the verdict. And I'm not going to soft pedal that. The road is there. The road is real. The roads are walkable. And every step you take, every record you preserve, every story you tell, every amicus that gets filed, every constitutional question that gets raised in a federal docket is a step to that the next person doesn't have to take alone. That's actually what solidarity is, not the communist version. That's the real kind, the actual kind that we were denied. And now accountability, just to be clear, is not actually vengeance, right? Accountability is truth on the record with names attached in a forum that a country can't ignore. Accountability is, what every honest civilization, I guess, has done for every atrocity, except for Turkey, every breach of trust, right? Every moment where people in power lied to the people they swore to serve. They were the Nuremberg trials. There was the Church Committee. There were the Pentagon paper. There was the AIDS activist movement that forced the FDA to change its protocols in the 80s and 90s, but yet Fauci was experimenting on single Black females and killing them by lying to tell them that they have HIV in the early 2000s. There's a long American tradition and a long human tradition of citizens, ordinary citizens, refusing to let the lie stand. But to be fair, the only ones that you can rectify are the ones that they allow you to, so you can feel like you're free. And I'm telling you that straight. You're only free on paper for now. That tradition, I guess, is yours now, right? It belongs to you, us. It's been handed to you. You're the next link in the chain. The grandmother in Ohio whose son died alone. The father in Texas whose daughter was injured. The child who needed organ transplant and couldn't get it. My friend Michael who needed a heart transplant wasn't allowed to get it. The widow in Pennsylvania who's still on discharge papers in a file folder in her closet. The nurse who saw what was happening on the ward and whose conscience has been screaming for 5 years. You're the next link. And the chain holds because each link doesn't, well, the only way the chain holds actually is if each link does its part. So I think it's time that people start doing their part. Seriously. People really need to start doing their part. Now I want to get bitchy. Okay? I want to get bitchy. I really want to get bitchy. I want to get super bitchy, actually. Give me a second. I really do want to get bitchy. I want to call some shit out. But trying to find and I can't. I was trying to find something to share, obviously, and it's not working for me. Oh, shit. It's really not there. Gosh darn it. I'm sorry, guys. I'm a one-woman band. My apologies. Shoot. No. Yeah. That's it. Okay, let's see. Did I find it? Yes, I did. You're going to say, how does this match up? It does. This is exactly what I need to play right now. Literally. Where is it? I literally just had it. It's so fucking weird. What the? Okay. No, not that. Oh. Yeah, let's take an intermission. Give me a second. That's crazy. Let's take a little break. And you know what? This isn't bad because actually this is exactly where people need to be.
Years from now, some of them may look back and ask themselves whether they've made the right choice, whether they've made the most of the opportunities they've been given. Together, we have the same mission. Over the course of your life, you will find that things are not always fair. You will find that things happen to you that you do not deserve and that are not always warranted. But you have to put your head down and fight, fight, fight. Never, ever, ever give up. Don't give in, don't back down, and never stop doing what you know is right. Nothing worth doing ever, ever, ever came easy. And the more righteous your fight, the more opposition that you will face. In your hearts are inscribed the values of service, sacrifice, and devotion. Now you must go forth into the world and turn your hopes and dreams into action. America has always been the land of dreams because America is a nation of true believers. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, they prayed. When the founders wrote the Declaration of Independence, they invoked our Creator 4 times. Because in America, we don't worship government, we worship God. It is why our currency proudly declares, "In God we trust." And it's why we proudly proclaim that we are one nation under God. The story of America is the story of an adventure that began with deep faith, big dreams, and humble beginnings. The next generation of American leaders never, ever give up. There'll be times in your life you'll want to quit. Never quit. Never stop fighting for what you believe in and for the people who care about you. Carry yourself with dignity and pride. Demand the best from yourself. The more people tell you it's not possible, that it can't be done, the more you should be absolutely determined to prove them wrong. Treat the word impossible as nothing more than motivation. Relish the opportunity to be an outsider. The more that a broken system tells you that you're wrong, the more certain you should be that you must keep pushing ahead. You must keep pushing forward. And always have the courage to be yourself. America is better when people put their faith into action. Pray to God and follow His teachings. Today, each of you begins a new chapter as well. When your story goes from here, it will be defined by your vision, your perseverance, and your grit. You will build a future where we have the courage to chase our dreams no matter what the cynics and the doubters have to say. You will have the confidence to speak the hopes in your hearts and to express the love that stirs your souls. As long as you have pride in your beliefs, courage in your convictions, and faith in God, then you will not fail. As long as America remains true to its values, loyal to its citizens, and devoted to its Creator, then our best days are yet to come. May God bless the class of 2017. May God bless the United States of America. And I just want to let you know that God blesses you. And I want to just say, you are special in every way. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you very much.
You're going to call us racist? You're going to call us potential Timothy McVeighs? Fuck you. War.
And so it is. Now, I think this is going to be the hardest part. I couldn't find what I wanted, but I believe that things happen because they happen. And this is going to be one of the hardest things that I'm going to say. So I want you to know that from this moment on, today, what I gave you was about the framework, the law, the EUA, the consent, the solitary, and the structure, right? Solitary, not solidarity. And I stand by every word of it and every word that will be written. Well, it's mostly been written, but actually published and edited in the FAUCI files. But this one is a little bit different. This one is personal. And I'm asking for a little bit of your patience right now, because I'm going to tell you some things about my own road that I don't usually talk about. And I'm going to tell you some things about the road you've been walked down by people you trusted that you may not be ready to hear. But it's all from love, so I'm going to say it. A lot of people know me as, you know, I don't know, right now, those that know me, oh, FAUCI files. Some know me as the people that have been helping Tina Peters. Others know me as the woman who writes these really long investigative articles like the Swift Code and the Turkey Doctoring and Inside Job. Other people know me as the person that's infiltrated Zoom and Jitsi calls and Signal chats, you know. Others, you know, as a former operative of people that don't exist, really don't exist. And a podcaster, I'm an author, citizen investigator, whatever. But what you may not know, and what most of you who found me in the last few years don't know, is that when I was talking about informed consent and bodily autonomy and the legal architecture of all types of freedom, medical freedom, about the uranium stuff, about everything. But let's just focus on the health stuff. Years before COVID was a phrase in your vocabulary. Years, not months, not hot take cycles. Years. And I was talking about it in the same voice, with the same framework, with the same, you know, legal citations in my mind, with the same pointed insistence that the path to fix this runs through the law, not through the camera. And nobody listened. And then when COVID happened and suddenly the rooms got full, but the rooms did not get full of people who wanted to do what I was offering them free information about to do. The rooms got full of people who wanted to cry about what I had been telling them. And the difference between those two things, the difference between acting on the framework and crying about the framework, right, is the entire reason we are still having this conversation. That's the bat phone. Give me a second. Where was I? Where was I? Sorry. As I was saying, I was telling a room full of very important people these things years before it happened. And then only to be met with fucking baby crying. Oh my God, Mark Elias. Oh my God, this. Oh my God, they're taking away our licenses. Oh my God. And that's why they had to do the election. Oh my God. We don't know what we're going to do. It's all in disarray because things happen that shouldn't have happened because people like to stick to fucking plans when plans should be malleable because you don't know who's there. That's why people who don't exist are working on overdrive. There's a difference between acting and crying about it. We're still having this conversation in this year of our Lord 2026 with no accountability, no structural fix, with the same people who lied to you still on television, still on tour, and still selling books. So bear with me. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit. Now, long before there was a coronavirus on stage in Wuhan, I was on the air, on my webpage, on social media, at the microphone, talking about something that most of America had no patience for. I was talking about the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. I was talking about interpreters. I was talking about how Congress, in that specific statute, the 1986 statute, immunized vaccine manufacturers from civil liability instead created a special claims court, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, where families of injured kids had to litigate against the federal government for compensation with a fund collected through excise tax on each dose. So basically, the pharmacy would be like, Here, for example, it would say, this is our new vaccine for babies. We're going to give them 4 doses. So you're going to buy it for $10. Well, here's the thing, dude. If we're giving it to kids and we're mandating this shit, 2 of those dollars are being put into a fund that you're going to give pharmaceutical companies so we could pay them if they come and sue us. Okay, that's fine. We'll just bill the insurance more. Bill the insurance more, and then we'll change the insurance so that way people are paying for a lot of shit and not getting fuck all. But if we get them on Medicaid, they have to get these vaccines or else they don't get benefits. So it's a win-win. And for those people that actually break through the system, they'll collect on those $2 per vaccine that we saved. Pretty simple, right? They fucked you in 1986 because they knew this was all a plan. They knew. They fucking knew. I was talking about 21 CFR, Part 50. The Code of Federal Regulations of Informed Consent. I would tell you how many times when you go to the doctor, don't sign that fucking paper. Ask them for it. It's a fucking book. They collect a shit ton of information on you. How many years have I been saying it? Ton. I've even done guest shows on foreign language stations. Arabic American radio, Greek American radio, French American radio, French Canadian radio. And we're going back to I'm going to take you back to 2013, 2014. Where I would talk about the NDAA and all these things where people need to be focusing, right? I did. The law said, obviously, the law says the 21 CFR Part 50 says that you have the right to alternatives. The law said you have the right to refuse. The problem was not the fucking law. The problem was the enforcement of the law. The problem was the gap between the regulations set on paper and what was happening to ordinary people. I mean, doctors that prescribed ivermectin were fired. No malpractice insurance, you're filed. Why? Because you just cost the hospital at least $100,000 with your fucking shenanigans for one patient. Oh no, your fucking Rolodex of patients you had. I was also talking about the Helsinki Declaration, about Belmont, about Common Rule, about how the investigative diseases, about Fort Detrick, about everything. I was trying to give you guys as much knowledge as possible to make you see it. Because the problem that we have in society since 1970 is that people are still industrialized in the form of education. I mean, that worked during World War I, World War II, but during a technological boom like we had in the 80s and 90s, that was obsolete. It just made idiots. Okay? It just made idiots. People that could not think for themselves, that outsource their thinking. That this is why I played the Milgram experiment so many times. I was like, hey, people just pay attention to the white coat. And the weird thing is that so many people that would hear me say this, because I was angry, just like I outburst earlier, because I get really, really angry because it was unnecessary. For what, dude? For $1,000, you sold out humanity because you wanted to take the piss on the only fucking person that was actually knew the plan. And so they made it something pedestrian, like I was a grifter and I was jealous, or that they were important and I wasn't. Bitch, I break bread with people you beg to take pictures with. I was talking about the PREP Act before the PREP Act was a household word. I talked about Amy Acton, who's now running for governor in Ohio. She's part of PEPFAR. We talked all about these things. When no one outside a few public health attorneys would even tell you what some of the acronyms that I used stood for. I was telling you in plain English that the country had built itself a regulatory architecture in which a sufficiently coordinated emergency declaration could effectively suspend it in operational practice. The entire informed consent regime that the country claimed to live by, I was warning you that this was a vulnerability. I was warning you that someone someday would walk through that door and fucking wreck it. I didn't know it would be COVID per se. I mean, I do have a crystal ball, but I didn't know when they were going to pull the trigger. I actually thought that they were going to do it at Ebola. That's why I was so active during that period of time with Ebola. But I knew the door was there, and I knew the door was unlocked. And I was trying to tell you that the door was unlocked, and I was screaming at the top of my lungs about the door that no one else in alternative media space was even pointing at it. And you know what happened? Almost nothing. The audience for that material was small, per se. Some lawyers listened, some parents of vaccine-injured kids listened, because they had already learned the hard way. A handful of independent researchers listened. Big conglomerates of journalists globally listened. But the broader audience that would later become the so-called medical freedom movement, that audience was not at the time assembled. That audience would only assemble when the door had been, that I had been pointing to, that I had been, trying to draw attention to, was actually kicked open. And a body fell out. And that body in 2020 was your father, your mother, your child, your friend, your sister, your wife, your cousin, everything. I had been telling you the door was there. I had been telling you the door was unlocked. And I had been telling you what you needed to do to lock it. But I guess people didn't have ears to hear and weren't ready to listen. I understand. And I'm not blaming the people, right? I'm just laying down the chronology. During COVID. When COVID hit, I was already on it. I didn't have to spin a new beat. I didn't have to suddenly become an expert in something that I had not studied. I had been studying it for years. The framework was already in my head. The citations were already on my notebooks. The case law was ready on my shelf. So when the EUA started rolling out, when the protocol started locking down, when the alternatives started disappearing from the menu, I was telling you in real time, this is the framework. This is the consent preservation. Here is how it's being treated as a formality. Here's what you should be doing instead. And when I say telling you, my audience got only the consumer digestible snippets. I'm talking about big rooms, big names, and your fucking stupid truther media, okay? All of them included, top to bottom, okay? And I know all of them fucking feel like shit right now. But it's okay. I said, I fucking take names. And I meant it. Now, I was telling my audience to demand consent forms. I was telling to ask in writing what alternatives have been considered. And I know everyone was shot down. I was telling to document the refusal, to document the request, to file the lawsuits, to keep originals, to just keep going at it. And I was doing it too at a time where I was extremely ill, like deathly ill. Like I was going to die in 2022. I was really ill. And yet I still kept powering through because I was like, someone's going to listen, something's going to happen, some delay, some this, and the administration, as much as they could, without ruining the prime floor for the Biden administration, did what they could. They did their best. And I thank President Trump for that. I know a lot of people are like, he could have done more. He couldn't do shit more. Okay. The only way to fix it is to call a demon by its name. So, and here's what was like happening simultaneously while I was on air giving you the actual path, the actual path to take. An entire economy was assembling itself around your fear. An economy of events, an economy of summits, an economy of panels, an economy of speaker tours, an economy of books with red and black covers and one-word titles, an economy of merchandise, an economy of paid subscriptions and exclusive memberships and inner circles, where for a special tier donor support, you could get a little extra access to the personality that was scaring you in public for free, right? That economy was big, and that economy was loud. That economy had professional press representation and bookers and stage managers and lighting. The economy could fill venues. That economy made and is still making real fucking money. That economy did not, by and large, do what it was telling you to do. That economy did not, by and large, file briefs. That economy did not, by and large, build the structural record. That economy did not buy and, they didn't pursue the tight legal line that ran through 21 CFR 50. They just talked about shit. And the EUA statute and the PREP Act exclusions and the Westfall Act carve-outs and the constitutional questions that had to be teed up below in order to be reached above. That economy did events. That economy did testimony. That economy did panels. That economy let nurses and doctors and grieving parents stand at a podium and weep for an audience that paid to be there. And the audience left feeling something. The audience left feeling seen. The audience left feeling like something had happened. And the next month, the next event was scheduled, and the next ticket was sold, and the next book was launched, and the next subscription was rolled out, and the speakers got back on the plane and went home. I'm not saying that the people on those stages didn't care. Some of them did. Some of them still do. I'm saying that the model, the business model, the economic structure of what was being built around your fear and your grief, that model was not pointed out in the courthouse. That model was pointed out in the box office. And the difference between those two things matters more than almost anything else I'm going to tell you. Hence why I have my influencer sheet. Okay? This is why I would decline going to such events. The only time that I would attend events like that is because I would have meetings under the guise of attending the event. So that way people wouldn't know who I was talking to. They would just think I was like invited as an influencer. Or, oh, look at Thirsty Tori. She's such a grifter. This is our place. Or, because they knew I knew. But like I said, and I know this sounds really evil, I like to tell people who are on a train that's burning and ready to crash that it's happening. And then I like to sit in a lawn chair and sit like this and be like, yo, I kind of told you this was going to happen. Now you can't escape because I've already told you. And that's where you're going. And that's exactly what I'm doing now. I'm enjoying the spoils of those. It hasn't happened yet, but it will. Now, that's a big problem for me. And all of you still follow these idiots. But when the worst of the acute phase passed, when the bodies stopped piling up at the rate they'd been piling up, when the country started, however unsteadily, to come out of the lockdown posture, and I kept going. I didn't stop. I did not pivot to other stuff. I didn't let a moment slip. I kept writing, I kept filing, I kept connecting the framework. I started a long investigative series that you have read and are going to read. You know, in the past like 2 weeks, I've written over 200,000 words. Anyway, I took my place as lead amici in certain things. I work with lawyers who actually wanted to win, not lawyers who wanted to lose loudly. I focus on the structural questions because that is where the structural fix lives. You know, you want to fix something, you got to fix the foundation, right? And I kept doing it without the apparatus that the event economy enjoyed. Without the bookers, without the publicists, without the inner circle subscription tiers, without the merchandise drops, without the speakers bureau, without the green room. And I want to tell you something now that I haven't said in this kind of detail in a long time, because I people deserve that. You know, while the event economy was filling auditoriums and stadiums, while the personalities were doing their tours and paying for events at Mar-a-Lago to look like really special or favored by the president, or taking picture opportunities, or, you know, riding Lindell's coattails until he was spent, right? While all of that was happening, the book deals, their check marks back on the platforms that have previously suspended them, while all of that was happening, I was actively being silenced harder. My bank accounts were closed more than once by more than one institution. Without warning, without explanation, without recourse. If you have not had this experience, I want you to imagine for a moment what it does to a working person, a single mother, a small business operator, to wake up and discover the bank that you've used for years decided without any process or challenge that you're no longer a person worth holding deposits for. Imagine that. Imagine the calls you've had to make. Imagine the bills that bounced. Imagine the explanations you can't give to your landlord, your vendors, your kids. Good thing is I always paid my rent in advance, but I was going into surgery like a few days later because I would have been dead. And that all happened to me. I was banned from platforms people use every day. I still haven't gotten my account back on Twitter, right? YouTube owes me tens of thousands of dollars that I don't get because I was banned because they said so. The New York Times and the legacy media went to extensive work to penetrate the leaked data on Twitch and to say, I only have 25,000 followers. How the fuck am I getting so many views? Because again, what you see on your screen is not accurate. The back end tells you a lot more. They know. And that's why I comply with it now. Now on Instagram, like, if I near up 22,000 followers, I'll just block and unblock people randomly just to keep my numbers under. Because that pisses them off more. How the fuck did this bitch have pull when she keeps her numbers so low? Well, that's because I don't need numbers to tell me that I'm the shit. I don't need numbers to tell me that I'm right. I don't need numbers to tell me that the people drink from my well. But those that have sponsors do. I mean, my well would be a shit ton better. I would be able to fucking, yesterday I ran across, or was it this morning? The times are blurring because right now, after this, I have to run to the hospital and take care of my mom too. So it's like I'm in the in-between. I'm taking a little bit longer than I should. But it's so fucking weird just thinking about it. Like, all these people are, are out there online. Like, there's this one guy, I think he posted something like, who wants money? And I'm thinking, if all my listeners actually just gave me $1 once a month, all of them, not like one or two, I would have an insane amount of money and I would fuck shit up so hard. There would be no way out. I've tried to collaborate with people from generals to, former this, former that. Unless they do it and keep me out and take the glory, specifically said to me, not the people that they did it. They're not running with it. So immediately I would publish my shit. It'd be like, oh, really? Publish. Oh, really? Publish. I don't work well with people that try to monetize on pain. That's one thing my dad told me when we were laughing. And I was like, oh my God, I was a kid. Well, in my late teens. I said, oh my God, this lady thought she was going to get pregnant. I saw something. This lady thought she was going to get pregnant because she had anal sex. It's so weird. He goes, well, where do you think lawyers come from? And so that was like his joke. And I was like, what? He's like, listen, I just say that because people that are shitty have to come out of shitty places. He goes, shitty people are the people that make money off of people's pain. I'll remember that forever. More so because he said, where do you think lawyers come from? I found that funny. But, I was banned from everywhere. Sometimes shadow ban, which is worse, like X does. I actually pay them money so that my content can be seen and it's still not seen. It's something like what Mike Cernovich said about Facebook when he was paying for ads and he wasn't getting traction. I'm going to let it roll because my ass is going to ask for the receipts on that bitch at some point. And I'll just model whatever Mike Cernovich did years ago. Anyway, when you're shadow banned, which is worse, right? You can't even point to the act and say, there it is. There's a censorship on this day with this notice, right? You just feel like you're talking into the void. You just feel like the reach is evaporating. You just feel yourself becoming invisible to the people you were trying to talk to. Like the one day that X actually redid their metrics, I'm not joking, redid their metrics where they reset it, I went live on that day. I had 270,000 people watching me on X. The day that I had no shadow ban on me because they had reset their metrics, so they hadn't implemented it yet. It was a sweet spot that evening. 270,000 just on X watching me because that little code by my handle was removed. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that very interesting? Now, legacy media didn't ignore me. Now they're leaving me alone. But that would have been a mercy. Legacy media came at me with smears, with write-ups, with insinuation, with the kind of selective framing that takes a person who is doing real research and makes them, in the eye of the casual reader, into a cartoon. There were stories run about me that were not journalism. There were operations. I know what an operation looks like, and I know when one is run on me. There are things that happened to me in those years that almost no one knows. I'm not going to put all of them out on the table. Some of them are still inside legal processes. Some of them involve people who were close to me. Some of them are mine to keep until I decide otherwise. But I want you to understand that the price I paid for telling you in plain English what was actually happening, that price was real. And it wasn't theoretical, and it didn't come with a speaker fee, and it didn't come with a book launch. It didn't come with a green room. And I want to ask yourself, I want you to do that. Why? Why did the silencing apparatus that was supposedly aimed at the medical freedom movement come from me with that level of intensity while letting the event economy go on and on, year after year, tour after tour, book after book? Think about it for a second. Why was the economy built on your pain from the right wing to create all of these events and do all of these things, be visible, but specifically the people that were actually giving tangible methods, tangible information, accurate legal information silenced? Ask yourself. Same cloth kind of thing, right? I hope you're getting it. I'll tell you, though, why. Because I was actionable, right? Because what I was telling you to do, if you actually did it, would have produced consequences. Filings, records, briefs, constitutional questions teed up correctly in the right courts at the right time. I mean, even in my own state of Ohio, all these other groups popped up. They were like, we know better. We're doing this. You don't know. We're going to do this. It totally spread it. We weren't even unified, right? The event economy didn't produce any consequences. The event economy produced catharsis. Catharsis is not a threat to anyone. The framework on the docket is. That's why they came for me and not for them. Catharsis was tolerated. Catharsis was in many ways useful because catharsis kept the audience emotionally exhausted and intellectually unfocused and structurally inert, right? Catharsis was the pressure valve. The event economy, oh, come to the Clay Clark, blah, 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 blah. It was the economy, it was a pressure valve, right? And the pressure valve doesn't get punished. The valve actually gets funded by somebody. The question of by whom is one we'll return to in a later part in the FAUCI files. But for now, I just want this asymmetry to sit with you for a minute. The person telling you what to do got debanked. The people putting on the show got booked. That's not a coincidence. That is a system functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Okay. Now, I want to also say a few things about the broader pattern, and I'm going to keep this at a level of pattern because I want you to be the one who applies the pattern for specific personalities in your informational diet. I'm not going to do that work for you. I want you to do it. I want you to look at the people that you've been following, and I want you to apply the test. The pattern is this. There's a category of personality in the alternative and right-leaning information ecosystem that built an enormous following on the back of COVID-era fear and outrage. Those personalities did not, before COVID, have particular expertise in regulatory law, in informed consent, in clinical trials, architecture, and vaccine compensation jurisprudence. The personalities became an expert during, or more precisely, that personality became brand expert during. The expertise was thin, but the brand was thick, right? That personality monetized aggressively. Subscription tiers, live events, bookings, speaking tours, conferences, branded merchandise, donation drives, inner circles, private channels, premium access, each of those a revenue stream. Each of those revenue streams fed by the intensity of the audience emotional engagement with the topic. That personality did file lawsuits in some cases, or supported lawsuits, or fundraised for lawsuits, but those lawsuits in pattern after pattern suffered from one or more following defects: thin pleading, poor selection of defendant, statute of limitation problems, and failure to anticipate immunity defenses, derivative copying of other people's case theories without attrition or coordination, theatrical filings designed for press release rather than judicial outcome. And many of those filings replicated and tainted prior, more carefully constructed cases by introducing weaker plaintiffs, weaker theories, or sloppy briefing into the same factual territory, making it harder, not easier, for the next plaintiff to win. And if I remember correctly, it was the Brian Cates team and all those people and the Ann Vandersteels that were making bank off of your pain. Now we're having their titties out, telling you how sad you got to be and how authoritarian this government is. Oh, Biden doing this shit. Biden was not fucking president, you son of a bitches. And you fucking knew, and you just kept peddling it. Now, ooh, I want to be mean. I remember it was Ali Akbar, that pedophile, right? That was sicked onto me by Roger Stone. Fuck you, Roger, for doing that. But thank you to Ratcliffe's new CIA. We've got some good people, right? Who said that I file cases just to disallow other people to file cases. When in turn, in actual fact, my cases were actually sound. None of them brought up industrial anything. None of them even tried to replicate that because they knew that it would be a call out. All the other things were kind of nominal, right? Okay. None of them did that. I'm trying to warn you for what's coming. I've told you this before. Your saviors only need to do one action and suddenly they're your new dictators. Be careful who you throw your eggs in whatever basket you want. You have to be very careful on that. Now, I want you to understand that these personalities, when challenged on the strategic incoherence of litigation portfolios they had, they would respond with marketing rather than the legal answer, with rallies, with international tribunals that have no jurisdiction, with citizen grand juries that have no power, with reports from panels that have no legal weight. Each of those is content. Each of those is fundraising. None of those is action. And the audience, you, were in the most precise economic sense of the word, the product. When something's free, the product is you. How many times have I said that? The product that was being sold to advertisers, to sponsors, to other personalities in the same ecosystem who wanted access to your attention, to publishers who wanted to leverage your loyalty, to political operations that wanted your data and your turnout. Your fear was the raw fucking material. Your grief was raw material, and the death of the person you loved or knew was in the supply chain of this economy, the raw material. I'm sorry. I know that it's brutal to hear, but I wouldn't say it if it wasn't true. And you need to hear that. I want to be clear on that. I want to be here and present right now as I tell you that. It is extremely important you understand what I just told you. And as I said, don't take my word for it. Pay attention to those that you still follow and look at their consistency. Look at who had been your friend. I mean, imagine all those healthcare events you went to. You had fantastic doctors and nurses talking, who were just talking, and they were getting paid to talk, which is not bad. Most of them lost their job. But then the people that were putting them on and promoting them were making money because they were telling their sponsors, they have you. I'm popular. I'll bring them. That's money. You can have vendors. You. I can write books. You. I can do this. You. This is why I have my sponsorship models. Oh, and bitches, you can delete your sponsors all you want. I got you back since 2015. How about that? And when you see that people like Medias Touch or the Bulwark, right, overlap in funding with patriots and people that were on the Q board as patriots, then you sit and think and you're like, wait a minute, the same pocket's funding these people? What? This is why I told you, turn every motherfucker off and only listen to your president. And even though if you only listen to him and not the commentators, you would not be in the position you are right now. We as a nation would not be in the position we are right now. Now, here's the part that hurts the most to tell you, because if it were just history, I could let it go, right? If it were just the past decade, let's say, I could write it up, file it, and move on. But it's not the past. It's actually the present, the right now. Because so many of you, after having everything, even after watching every cycle repeat for 5 to 6 to 7 years and still following those personalities, are still buying those books, are still buying those subscription tiers, are still showing up at those events, are still sharing their videos, are still defending them when somebody points out the pattern. And every dollar you give them, every click you give them, every hour of your attention you give them is $1 and a click and an hour that's not going into the structural work that would actually produce the accountability you say you want. Every event you attend instead of writing your story down, every book you buy instead of preserving your records, every donation you give to a personality instead of supporting the unglamorous, unsexy, behind-the-scenes work of amicus filings and constitutional briefing and citizen investigator infrastructures. I'm not saying you're stupid. I would never say that. You're not stupid. You're grieving. And grieving people are vulnerable people who know how to make them feel something. And that's not a moral failing on your part. That's a structural feature of how grief operates. The people who built the event economy on top of your grief know exactly how grief operates. They're professionals. They've studied. They've tested data on what headlines to convert. They're influence operations experts. They have testing data on what subject lines move product. They are very, very good at what they do. So what I'm asking of you tonight is not that you become as sophisticated as they are. What I'm asking from you is to start to apply one test. One test. I'm live. Yeah, thanks. One test. Just one. Sorry, my niece is here and I have to get going. So, I don't know if I should say that. I don't know if I should say that. You know what? Yeah. One test, the action test, right? When you encounter a persona at an event, a book, a Substack, or a podcast, right? Ask one question. What does this person want me to do with what they're telling me? Again, when you read an article, ask yourself, what do they want me to do with what I'm reading? If the answer is to feel something, be careful. If the answer is to be afraid, be more careful. If the answer is donate, subscribe, and attend my next event, be most careful of all. Now, if the answer is to write your story down, preserve your records, contact the following counsel, support the following amicus filings, read the following docket, call your congressman, call your Senate, write to the president, write to the first lady, speak with your neighbors, get a coalition together, work together. Let's all work together. Let's unite. That's somebody who's pointing you at action. The first kind monetizes you. The second one builds with you. And most of you are old enough to tell the difference. I trust that. Now, this is why I'm always mad. I never have phrased, I try to, my emotional state on this topic, right? I'm not angry. I have been angry. I was angry for a long time, particularly during the years of the silencing. That it bothered me, right? When I would watch the event economy fill auditoriums, while I'm being shut down and I'm actually putting a dent into the system, and my reach was being, throttled. My name was being smeared. I'm not angry anymore. I work through that anger. I'm still mad though, but it's not productive. And the anger is not where truth lives. But I mean, if the people that were closest to you stole from you, sabotaged you, tried to kill you a couple times, did a bunch of shit to you, your bank accounts are closed, people defame you all the time when they've never even fucking met you. They don't even know who you are. And then when they see you in a room with cabinet officials, they're like, why the fuck is this person here? Yeah, bitch. That's why. That's the problem, right? That's where I get mad. But I would say my anger now is more sadness, genuinely and deep sadness. And I feel sad because I see people who are full of love and potential, who I love, people who have written to me, people who have come up to me at the rare events that I do attend, people whose stories I carry, who are still, after everything, still following the personalities who made sure they couldn't act, who are still putting their loyalty, their attention, their dollars, their advocacy into a system that processed their grief into product and then sold the product back to them. This happened with elections too. I don't even want to start on Patrick Colbert and fucking Cause of America and fucking Patrick Byrne and America First audits and all this bullshit. Again, it was to stymie action so that you guys can't see shit, that you guys see the big names and the lights and you follow it like deer do. That's why we hit them with our cars, right? I also feel really sad because people who have lost the most, the parents who lost children, the spouses who lost partners, the parents who vaccinated their children, the people who took the vaccine, the children who lost parents, friends, loved ones, nurses who lost their licenses for telling the truth, doctors who lost practices for offering alternatives. Those are the people who can least afford to be sold to the wrong story. They've already paid. They have already given the system everything they had. And the event economy comes around and takes a second cut, sometimes even a fucking third. I mean, we see Alex Jones with the hantavirus now. I feel sad because the years are passing, statutes of limitations are running, witnesses are aging, documents are being destroyed, memories are fading. Every year that the audience is parked in catharsis instead of action is a year in which structural case gets weaker, not stronger. We're running out of time. And your side, you fucking pigs, derailed the people from action, buying time for the motherfuckers that wanted this shit to happen. Every single one of you. Knowingly, unknowingly, willingly, unwillingly. Who wrote that? I did. Now, I feel sad. Their motto depends on the next new ticket sale right now. It doesn't depend on a verdict. I've been saying this for years, and maybe it doesn't come off right. And I'm not even going to blame myself. I went through hell in 2018, 2019, and 2020. My health was shit. I was on the verge of death for 2 years while I fought like nobody's been. I couldn't even walk without being out of breath because my diaphragm was being pulled down, right? I was jaundiced. I couldn't breathe. And they tried to poison me on top of me being sick. And yet I still went through it. That's sadness. It's not anger. And it's not bitterness because I know they're going to get theirs. Oh boy, are they. Nothing will remain hidden. But it is a specific grief of watching people you care about, people in your niche, and walk past a door you've been pointing at for a decade. But I don't want to end this on sadness, right? I've never ended on sadness. The sadness is real. The sadness is honest. But the sadness is not the bottom. The bottom is this. You have right now the ability to do something different. Always, every single day. You have right now the ability to apply the action test. You have right now the ability to look at your information diet and ask yourself, honestly, who is in this list is pointing me to action and who is monetizing on my fear? And who, it's like Jordan Sather. He posts great, random content. But from making smoothies to being an expert, really difficult for me to digest. I understand General Flynn. He's an expert at influence operations and psychological operations. So is Tracy Beans. Again, you have the ability right now, the ability to reallocate, to unfollow the catharsis machines, to follow the people who do, who want to do, who try to do, to stop, benefiting the people that are only benefiting off of your fear, rage, and sadness. Stop weeping at panels and start writing your own fucking story. Discernment. Said this before. It's the first act of resistance. Discernment is what they don't want you to develop. Discernment is the muscle that once it's built makes you useless to the catharsis economy and dangerous to the structure that survives on it. And that doesn't, and you know what's interesting? The black pill economy was genius because they formulate their black pilling into discernment. And when you actually look at it, it's not discernment, it's another operation. So be the muscle, right? Build it. And don't be ashamed of where you've been. Don't feel humiliated for having followed the wrong people. I mean, I have people here that were talking about that squirrel thing, you know? I'm not gonna laugh. We've all been led down wrong roads in our life. The shame is not in having walked them. The shame is only refusing to turn around once you see that they go nowhere. You know, like what's Alpha Warrior got to say as a cop that was dirty? You have the ability to turn around quietly too, without announcement, without picking a fight with anyone. Just turn around and start walking the other way. And when you look up, people don't look up anymore, you will find a small but growing group of a lot of us walking quietly with our heads down, doing the work, filing, preserving, investigating, connecting, and briefing. We're not loud. We don't have green rooms. We don't have inner circles. We're mostly just citizens with notebooks. There's a room on this road for every American citizen. There always has been room on this road. The road is not exclusive. The road is just narrow, and it does not get the lighting that the other road gets. So I urge all of you to walk with me down that road, because even though it's dark, our light is what lights the way. Faith, love, courage, discernment. And that fourth one, discernment, is the one I'm advocating for tonight. Because faith without discernment becomes credibility. Well, credulity, not credibility, credulity. It becomes credulity. And love without discernment becomes an attachment to people who are using us. And courage without discernment becomes loud noise that goes nowhere. So discernment is what makes the other three components actually work. I've been saying this for years, before COVID, during COVID, after COVID, and I'll keep telling you. Even if the platforms keep coming for me, even if the banks keep closing my accounts, even if the legacy media keeps running its operations, even if the event economy keeps printing money on the back of your grief, I'm not going anywhere yet. And I'm not going to stop saying the thing that's true just because the thing that's true is unpopular with the people who would prefer you to stay parked in catharsis forever. We drink from the well and we're not thirsty. It's not the story they tell you that's important. It's what they omit. We've said this before. And that's the biggest issue here. So on that note, someone asked me to do this. So I'm going to do it. Hold on, let me add it. Yeah, this is my amicus that I put together myself, where I walk it through, and I'm hoping to get it to that case at Lindsay. I'm going to see to get with them. So I can read you out my conclusion. The questions presented by this case, though framed in the technical language of statutory construction and constitutional doctrine, are at their core questions of accountability. When the government, acting through the Food and Drug Administration, conditioned the emergency use of an unapproved drug on the patient's right to be informed of the option to refuse, it did so under the authority of a statute that Congress wrote and that this court is bound to enforce. When hospitals received that authorization, accepted federal payment for administering the drug, and then failed to honor the patient's statutory right to refuse, they did not simply commit ordinary medical malpractice. They acted outside the scope of the very authorization that the government extended. The PREP Act, as Congress wrote it, does not immunize that conduct. the construction of the PREP Act adopted by certain federal and state courts, the immunity attaches to all administration during declared emergency, regardless of whether the conditions of authorized were satisfied, has rested on defense to agency interpretations that the Supreme Court has now overruled in Luper-Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo in 2024. After Luper-Bright, this court must independently construe the statute. The independent construction, the construction urged by amicus, produces a result that the next statute's text plainly compels. PREP Act immunity attaches to administration of covered countermeasure in accordance with Section 564, not to administration that violated the conditions Section 564 itself imposed. Specifically, the amicus respectfully submits the court should do. First, that the term covered countermeasure in 42 U.S.C. 247D, Tax 6D, I1C is defined by reference to authorization in accordance to Section 564 and accordingly does not encompass administration that violated patient information conditions imposed by 564E1A and the FDA's letter of authorization. Second, the PREP Act immunity 42 U.S.C. 247D, Tax 6D Alpha 1 does not attach to the administration that falls outside of the covered countermeasure status, including administration to patients who met FDA's own EUA exclusion criteria. Third, the Department of Health and Human Services advisory opinions construing the PREP Act extensively are not entitled to the Chevron defense following the Luper-Bright Enterprises v. Raimondo and are not persuasive under Skidmore in light of the statutory text and structure. Fourth, that the major questions doctrine forecloses any agency interpretation that would affect a vast displacement of state common law without clear congressional authorization. And fifth, that the New York doctrine informed consent established in Schlondorf is codified in New York public health law 2805 Tac D and the medical battery doctrine are not displaced by PREP Act immunity for administration that occurred outside of the conditions of authorization. Six, that the six independent constitutional conserve substantive due process, the Seventh Amendment civil jury right, the Fifth Amendment takings clause, procedural due process, the 10th Amendment, and the First Amendment right to receive information, counsel a narrow construction under the constitutional avoidance canon. Seventh, that the international norms of medical ethics articulated at Nuremberg in Helsinki and the Belmont Report, while not directly binding, inform the constitutional avoidance analysis and counsel narrow construction. Eighth, the Federal Regulatory and Financial Architecture, including Patient Self-Determination Act, CMS Conditions of Participations, the CARES Act Section 3710 adjustment, and the NC TAP add-on payment operates in a pari materia with Section 564 to require informed consent in connection with administration of EUA products in Medicare participating hospitals. Ninth, that the international evidentiary records confirms that the adverse event profile of remdesivir was known and documented at the time of administration, rendering the Section 564 patient information conditions material as a matter of fucking law. Amicus takes no position on any other issue presented in this litigation. Amicus files solely to assist the court with the statutory and constitutional analysis of the threshold scope question in service of the correct interpretation of federal law. I wrote that over the years. I verbalized it, and I'm going to tell you something, and I'm not going to name names yet. I do have my list. I did approach many attorneys that were filing lawsuits. I even approached people that you think are fighting for you from very elevated status. And I told them that if they hook themselves on remdesivir, they can get everything done, not just for the hospitals, but for the vaccines. They refused. None of them actually read it. One person that did read it, and that's the only person I will not make public on the list, said I can't. They threatened my family. So I'm going to let the other lawyers take point. I really wish you went to law school. It hurts seeing it because they're trying to bring it out again. And I think it's just a scare and they're testing the water. This isn't it. When it does come, it's going to get all of us sick. vaccinated or not vaccinated. And that's basically what they're doing. They want you to say, I'm not fucking taking it. And then we get fucked. So again, discernment, trusting your gut is important. And when I'm salty, it comes from a place of sadness more than anger. You know, I've learned to appreciate Judah. You know, reading the Bible over and over again, Judah's is highly appreciated. So we'll see how this amicus goes, if an organization will file it or if I will file it. But in every fucking viable case right now, I will approach those attorneys and say, will you allow me to submit an amicus? Because they have to let you submit it. And I don't see why they wouldn't, because they're going to lose anyway. The system was built to make them lose. And the way litigation goes, they can't put a structural analysis, but we the people can. And I think it's important that we are able to do that. So I do have a list of New York attorneys that may ad hoc my guy, and there's a law firm that was suggested to me too to file it if I can't ad hoc it. Now that's for New York, but at New York, I could also do pro se, but then the standard is a little bit higher. So if I have an attorney actually representing me, it'll be a lot more easier to get the judge to accept it, because that's if I get leave from the actual plaintiffs. We'll see. So on that note, I'm going to leave you with that. Fauci Files will be coming. Don't forget to watch my SPLC thread. That shit is on point. I'm giving them all the tools, and you're going to see it all play out. I'm just educating you on it so that way you can observe the things that maybe I've missed, or that maybe your senator or congressperson has missed. And remember, aliens have been here for a while. Don't listen to that shit, okay? We've been here for a very long time. Very, very long time. On that note, I have to get going. I'm going to leave you guys with a cool-ass tune. God bless.
Love is free, love me, say hell yes. No doubt, but I rock a little know-how. No doubt for the piggies or the ooskow. Get smart, get down with the power. Never been a better time than right now. Bob Marley, forward and a profit. Bob Marley, got me hot the outfit. Bob Marley, walking like a talking. Goodness me, can't you see I'm gonna drop it? Give it away, give it away, give it away now. Give it away, give it away, give it away now. Give it away, give it away, give it away now. Like with the agility, come and drink it.